Right, okay. Are there any bits this week? Are we doing a bit?
No. There's no guests this week. There's no bits. We're straight in. We're raw dog with no kissing. This is Kino Inferno.
Yep.
Classic.
Full fat, full dick. Classic Kino. We're not in the woods. We're not in the Digiverse.
Not in the digital world or the Russian.
We're
that was.
Many beat.
We're not doing that.
That was something that happened.
When we're also not in the back of a van.
Oh yeah, we were on a quiz show, weren't we? I forgot about that.
Yeah, none of that shit. We're just back in the studio. The Kino Inferno studio, located in your mind.
It might as well be the fucking Inferno studio. It's hot as fucking balls today. Jesus Christ.
Once again, it is hot as fuck, and we ask our American listeners to not comment on this.
It's fucking hot, alright? So hot.
It is warm as shit.
I'm Swampy Joe downstairs right now, and I'm not happy about
it. My butthole has never been moister.
That's not true. You've been in a room with me. There we go. Now we're back to classic Kino.
Foreplay. We're supposed to be straight in, no kissing. Enough prevaricating around the bush. This episode is episode 6 or 7. And it's episode 6 or 7 of season 1 or 2.
We planned this series, Aiden. We actually planned this one. And
we're back, baby. And we're here to talk about the film genre of neo-noir cinema is what we're here to talk about. We have hand-selected 2 films of that ilk to discuss. But before we do that, I'm going to put Mark on the spot, as I did on the Jello episode all those many moons ago, and ask him to explain to the listeners who might be just idiots, just not know things, just fucking head empty, no thoughts.
You know who you are.
What neo-noir... Well, what film noir is and what neo-noir is. What's the distinction? I hope you wrote notes.
I didn't write any notes. However, when I first started studying film, way back when, because, we're both old as fuck now, film noir was one of the first things that they had us look at. So I remember I've actually seen quite a few of the sort of classic film noirs. So for people who don't know, and I'm surprised people wouldn't know what film noir is, because it's so popular and it's used so much in popular culture. So essentially, film noir refers to a genre of movie that was around in the 30s and 40s, which is very much a standard hard-boiled detective stories, the femme fatales. It's all, stark black and white cinematography with lots of shadows everywhere to hide how cheap all the sets were and stuff. And all of the characters are either morally grey or completely morally bankrupt, and there's always people double-crossing and murdering each other. There's always a central mystery, and most of the protagonists are dirty cops and stuff like that. It's your standard. Whenever you see any kind of like detective parody and there's a few shadows everywhere, that's what film noir is. That's for the idiots in the audience.
Yeah. I would also just expand on that. So the most common form that it takes is that kind of typical hard-boiled detective thing with your femme fatales and so on. But also film noir can just apply to kind of crime cinema made in that period. So if we're being, particularly picky about this, then technically film noir is specifically French-influenced genre that kind of starts in the 30s and ends in the early 50s. And technically anything considered after that's in that style after that is considered noir.
Also...
That is a meaningless distinction, to be honest.
And I mean, also, film noir as well, what I described is very much like the sort of stereotypical idea of what it is, because the most famous examples of it tend to be what I described. But film noir does also extend to things like horror films as well, and even like sort of dramas as well. Because the idea is obviously noir meaning black. It's like sort of dark cinema. That's the idea of it. So like way back when these films were around, a lot of films, in this ilk were kind of lumped together as being noir because they were, a little bit unsavory for most audiences,
And that's kind of where the French influence comes in as well, because obviously French films were not influenced by the American cinema codes of the time, the Hays Code and so And they kind of ended up, as these things do, influencing American cinema. That's where you get your classic American film noirs. And actually, a lot of the American film noirs kind of were what the Hays Code was railing against, because they was considered to be kind of salacious.
Yeah. By today's standards, they're really not.
Gangster movies. And,
they're very, very tame.
Well, because there's they are about, immorality in some regard, I suppose. They're usually about, gangsters and dodgy detectives and women who have sex.
Yeah, and everyone's always drinking and everyone's always smoking. Everybody in these movies smokes. Even, like, children smoke in these movies. Like, that's, again, it's a budgetary thing. It's cheaper than a smoke machine to just have all of your actors smoking cigarettes.
Yeah. And, in the sort of 30s, 40s, 50s, everyone smoked anyway.
Yeah, so you then move forward to the idea of what neo-noir is, and like you were already sort of saying, so anything that comes after the sort of classic era of what film noir was is considered neo-noir. And the idea is that a neo-noir movie doesn't necessarily have to have all of those elements that are so closely associated with noir movies. They just kind of have to borrow bits and just be sort of thematically similar. Because a lot of films that are considered neo-noir, you wouldn't necessarily associate with the sort of classic noir movies, with things like, like Double Indemnity and Mildred Pierce and stuff like that.
Maltese Falcon.
Yeah, and like, Brick, for example, was a neo-noir movie.
Yeah, Brick is one that I nearly picked for this one.
This is the thing. When we said we were going to talk about neo-noir movies, there's so many options. Because my pick, the one that I eventually settled on, was just because I felt like Well, I'm gonna level with you here. The reason why I picked the film that I did was because the last 2 episodes, like, we've just done animated movies, we've done kids movies, and I was like, you know what? It's time for filth. We need to bring back the filth. And so it was a choice between my pick of Basic Instinct or Bound. Bound was the other one I was thinking about including.
Yeah, Bound was a good choice. I was kind of between Brick and what I did pick, which was Drive. Because I only go for one-word titles.
I like 2 words. And also, Basic Instinct is like the most film noir title that you could possibly pick for a film. So.
I often, back in the day, got Basic Instinct and Fatal Attraction confused. Because they've both got those kind of slightly generic titles.
Yeah,
and they've both got Michael Douglas in as well. So.
That's very true. Well, although Fatal Attraction's kind of more of a riff on slasher movies, I would say.
Yeah, but they're both like erotic thrillers, kind of.
Erotic thrillers, yeah. And again, that's kind of one of the other big distinctions about neo-noir as well, whereas a lot of the classic noir movies were like dark thematically. They weren't typically that violent, and the sex was mostly non-existent in a lot of them as well.
Yeah, as it implies.
Neo-noir, however, just fucking plasters the screen with violence and sex.
Kitty.
Like, so much. So
I mean, certainly Basic Instinct certainly has all manner of carnal.
We shall get into it. I've always felt like Basic Instinct is you could possibly even view it as like almost a parody of film in a way.
So we got 31 stab wounds.
Or was it?
Ice pick.
I'd like to speak to Miss Catherine Trammell, please.
Is she a suspect?
She's a writer. She published a novel. It's about a retired rock and roll star who gets murdered by his girlfriend.
You know how she does the boyfriend? With an ice pick.
She intended the book to be her alibi.
You didn't feel anything for him. You just had sex with him for your book.
In the beginning, he gave me a lot of pleasure.
You like playing games?
Games are fun.
What's your new book about?
A detective. He falls for the wrong woman.
What happens?
She kills him. How's it feel to kill someone?
You tell me.
When retired rock star Johnny Boz is brutally murdered in his bed with an ice pick, troubled detective Nick Curran is brought in to investigate. He soon meets Catherine Trammell, Boz's ex-fuck buddy and noted author of psychological crime thrillers. The easily led Nick soon finds himself drawn into Catherine's web of booze, drugs and carnal sex, all the while Catherine is using Nick's story as the basis for her new book. The bodies continue to pile up and the plot soon thickens like aged soup, with numerous red herrings and weirdly implausible twists. But while the blood flies and the titties are sucked, we're left with one mystery that simply cannot be solved. And that is, why on earth did Nick wear that fucking ugly sweater to a nightclub?
Strong point. What was he playing at?
Honestly, like, it bothers me every time I've seen this movie.
And that is... Also, I want to point out, that nightclub is the least convincing nightclub in cinema.
It's the most 90s
no,
nightclub
it's pathetic. I was looking at the mise en scène. I was like, what is this? This is just clearly just some room that they've tried to pass off as a 90s like rave nightclub.
That's really brightly lit.
Yeah, exactly. The bright lighting is not doing them any favours. And everyone's dressed like it's like Zion in the Matrix. Like, what's going on? Apart from Nick, who, as you say, is wearing the ugliest dad sweater I've ever seen in my life.
And like slacks, I think.
It's insane. I mean, this movie... we'll get into this. This is, I think, maybe the second or third time I've seen this movie. I know we normally give like some initial thoughts before we delve deeper. I've got to say, man, maybe a controversial take. I don't think this movie's any good. It's the kind of movie, I've got to say, every time I see it, I'm like, oh, Basic Instinct, this will be fun. And then it kind of is. But it's just also like, I forget how much of this movie is just like Michael Douglas just kind of wandering around and not really doing much. And then occasionally there'll be
Sharon Stone just kind of talking at him.
Like, there's a lot of conversations that are like, do you want to come in and have sex? And he's like, yeah, I do. And it's just like, yeah. It's a very meandering film, I'll say that. For a psychological sex thriller, it kind of goes around the houses, in my view. We'll get into that more as we go along, but...
Yeah, I actually do agree with you to an extent, especially for a Paul Verhoeven movie. It's surprisingly stop-start, which, that's definitely something that struck me about watching it this time, because I hadn't seen it for a while either, but I've always kind of liked this movie. I mean, I don't think it's particularly
It's a very
good.
Mark from What Culture film. Like, this is a Mark Smith film, with Basic Instinct.
I think I've always kind of just admired how it revels in its own garbage nature, I think, and, that's the one thing for it that kind of does it for me, because like when this movie really is going hammer and tongs, it really goes hammer and tongs in a way that not a lot of other movies, particularly around this time, were really doing as well. Like mainstream.
The sex scenes are quite something, aren't they, in this movie? I don't think they're particularly erotic, but they're explicit.
No, because they're all quite violent in a way.
Yeah, but not enough.
Nobody is having pleasant sex in this movie. Yeah, it's all very. Yeah, it's very violent.
It's very. It's like, I don't know. There's something kind of uncomfortably porny about the sex scenes in this, where it's just kind of like.
Yeah, and this is one thing as well. Like, this film is actually noted for the fact that it really did kind of push the envelope as to what was acceptable to do in like a sort of major film. Because I mean, at the time, this film was made for what, $40 million, something like that. Because like Paul Verhoeven could, he could get big budgets back in the day. Because for the people who don't know, Paul Verhoeven is the mad genius behind such treasures like RoboCop and Total Recall. The
Flying Dutchman himself.
Mad shit. And this is what the other thing I'm just going to say, and this is one thing that again applies to Basic Instinct. Nobody shoots violence like Paul Verhoeven does.
Agreed.
That man is mad for stabbings and stuff. Like, he shoots violence like cum shots.
I mean, have you seen RoboCop? You've seen some pretty wild shit in that movie.
I remember the first time I saw RoboCop thinking, fuck me, that's an incredibly violent movie. Yeah. And then a few years later, I watched the uncut version of RoboCop.
Well, this is the thing.
And I was like...
Most of Paul Verhoeven's movies had to be... So people might not know this. If you've seen the version of RoboCop, which has like the Ed 209, like blowing the guy into tiny little chunks, that is the uncut version, which is normally which is now the version that's normally rotated, right? At the time, and pretty much every Paul Verhoeven movie would have been an NC-17 had they not gone on and re-edited it to be an R, and that applies to this movie as well. It wasn't until he released Showgirls that they just stopped doing that, because they tried to sell Showgirls as like, oh, it's the sexy movie full of sexy sex, and that was my Paul Verhoeven voice, the Dutch pervert voice. Sexy movies.
I mean, it's not far off what I would describe Paul Verhoeven as, and I love the man, don't get me wrong.
You guys want to see a sexy movie? Fucking gold member. So, he kind of... That's the thing that's interesting about Paul Verhoeven, is he's kind of a mainstream... He was for a time a mainstream filmmaker, worked in Hollywood. but he always has this slightly off-kilter sensibility. And sometimes that really works. Like, I think RoboCop's an interesting example where it's very much in the mould of an American kind of sci-fi action thriller, but it's also a parody of that, and it's kind of meshing those two ideas together. And obviously, Starship Troopers is the famous example of this, right? Where like it's a satire of the source material it's based on that kind of amplifies the fascist leanings that Verhoeven found in the novel, right? And that movie is fascinating to watch. By the way, we'll probably cover it at some point because people missed that it was a spoof, and I have to say, only in America. Because there's a scene where Neil Patrick Harris comes out towards the end, and he's dressed as an SS officer, and it's like, come on now. Anyway, that's.
Well, I think there's a lot of people who, and maybe slightly more understandably so, but there is definitely a lot of people out there who really miss the satire of RoboCop as well.
Again, I don't really know how because it's pretty on the nose.
Yeah, like it's not.
And that's not a diss on RoboCop. I love RoboCop. Don't get me wrong; it's a fantastic film. And if anyone's into that '70s show, they should check it out just for the sight of Red from that '70s show as one of the main villains in that movie.
Yes,
the fantastic Kurtwood Smith. He gets all the best lines in the film, right? Because he has like, oh my god! I mean, we're taking a detour from RoboCop quotes.
we're taking a detour to talk about better Paul Verhoeven.
But Kurtwood Smith in that movie as I've forgotten the character's name. You know the one, the guy.
I know who you mean. Yeah, I've not seen RoboCop for a while. Actually.
But he's fantastic in that movie. Just all his lines are the best. Like when he throws the guy out of the truck and he's like, "Can you fly, Bobby?" It's so good. Oh, guns!
But you were saying about how like a lot of his films are heavily censored. Like the uncut version of RoboCop, which like you say is now the more sort of wide.
Yeah, and that's true of most of his movies. Like the uncut versions have gone on to be the more circulated versions.
Yeah, exactly. Because I remember, again, like when I saw the uncut version of RoboCop thinking, how the fuck did this get more violent?
Yeah.
I didn't think it was possible, but here we are. And yeah, Basic Instinct was no different. It was actually only cut by about 40 seconds.
I know they cut some of the initial...
Like
some of the initial ice pick murder was cut because it was incredibly violent.
Yeah, and even now, that is still a fucking shockingly brutal murder to start.
Yeah, it's quite something.
So we should probably go into that.
Yeah, you might have to help me out here, because on the rewatch, I was kind of drifting in and out towards the end.
That's fine. I can guide you through the sordid world of Paul Verhoeven's Basic Instinct. So we start on the opening credits, which are implying eroticism. There's a lot of sort of sensual music and vague ideas of flesh as well.
Who did the score to this movie?
I don't know, but it's kind of great, the score, because it is very much a noir score.
I'm gonna do a modicum of research and find it.
Loopy, that's all we, me and him and them and me. We'll show you what we can do with a load of balls and a snooker cue.
So, I can tell you, Mark, that the score was done by one Sir Jerry Goldsmith, Hollywood composing legend. Yes.
Iconic Jerry Goldsmith.
Which makes what I'm about to say sting a little bit more. I think his work on this film is dog shit, but carry on.
I like the score to this movie just because it is very in keeping with what the movie's trying to be. I think it's a very appropriate score. But no, we have this score playing and this implied eroticism, and then the opening shot of this movie is a couple writhing around on a bed fucking, and we then reveal that we're seeing them through a mirror that's on a ceiling. So we're already getting into voyeurism and all kinds of freaky sex. And then we go down and see this couple having the carnal relations. And the woman, who we don't see her face.
I want to have intercourse with you. Relations. Edit that in.
And I've got a bit, like, they do a weirdly good job in this scene of hiding that woman's face. Because they're in the throes of passion and their hair's all over the place. And I was watching it again this time. I was like, you can't fully tell who it is. It's surprisingly well done. And so the woman takes out a white scarf and ties the dude's hands to the bed, and she rides him like Seabiscuit for another minute or so. And then, at the point of climax, she pulls an ice pick out from the bed and just stabs the living fuck out of this guy. That's how the movie starts.
Yeah, as one does. I've lost count of the amount of times that's happened to me, to be honest.
It's an epidemic, to be honest.
Gotta be careful out there, boys.
We are here.
Gotta be careful out there, boys.
We do have a charity to prevent the ice pick murders. There'll be details at the end of where you can donate.
And, I think if we've learned one thing from this movie, it's that you shouldn't sleep with bisexuals because they're all murderers.
That we can definitely talk about. But no, so after this dude gets...
Sorry, I should say sex perverts and murderers.
Oh, yeah, well, this is the thing, like, and one critic very rightly pointed this out, and we will delve deeper into it later, but there's a lot of controversy around this movie when it came out for its portrayal of, like gays, lesbian, homosexuality, bisexuality, I'm just going to do that again. When this movie came out, its depictions of, like, bisexuality and even, like, lesbians were very controversial for the time. But one critic did rightly point out that, yeah, those characters are kind of awful people in this, but everybody in this movie is awful. Like, nobody is really a good person.
Yeah, and, we can say that it's a good representation of bisexual people, because you're a bisexual man, I'm an enigma, and I think, based on that, we represent the bisexual community.
And we have killed. So
we are also murderers, so, from that point of view, it's a good representation of murderers.
So what we're saying is Basic Instinct is a documentary about bisexual people.
About Mark's life. You should see him with his little blonde wig on.
Call me Sharon.
I mean, the folding and unfolding leg scene is quite something when Mark does it.
That's very true.
His big,
I'd say it's more.
His big meaty space operas fall out. His tiny little penis is the weird thing. Just resting on top.
You leave my nubbin out of this.
It's very small. JK, Mike's got a massive dick, and so do I.
Well, don't like to brag or anything.
But this is we wanted to call this podcast The Big Dick Bros.
the legal advice room. The legal advice.
That's not even a guy. The legal advice room isn't even a guy. Anyway, should we talk about...
I don't know, it's so hot.
Should we talk about Basic Instinct?
We should talk about Basic Instinct, yes. So after the guy gets iced at the beginning, we're introduced to Nick Curran, played by Michael Douglas.
Yeah, in one of his greasiest performances.
Oh yeah, like he's
This
glistening.
man is slick with grease.
And I'm going to try and just breeze through the plot as quickly as I can just so we can talk about the movie, because like there's a surprising amount of story going on in this movie. Like it constantly adds layers on top of things. So Nick is brought in to investigate the murder of one Johnny Boz, who is a retired rock star. And so the first port of call is they go and see who they believe to be his girlfriend, who is Catherine Trammell, played by Sharon Stone. So he goes to question Sharon Stone's character, Catherine, and Catherine is immediately just playing mind games with him. One of her first lines of dialogue is pretty much when he says, "Oh, what was your relationship with Johnny?" She's like, "I was fucking him." She's very blunt about it. Like everything she says and everything she does is so calculated.
Also, everything she does is about fucking. Like she's obsessed.
Yeah, like she is, and she's obsessed with just having control over people and just being like, "I'm a hot woman. Let's do this." She has that kind of power.
Yeah, quite.
So we find out that Catherine is an author and writes sort of psychological thrillers. She also is skilled in psychiatry, is what they sort of say she is, because she has a degree.
Yes, she has a degree in psychiatry and a magna cum laude pussy, if we learn that later.
Fuck of the century is, I believe, what they refer to her as.
Yeah, his mate at one point there goes, "Just that magna cum laude pussy, let's get your brain fried."
There is some choice dialogue in this
movie. There is, and if you just excuse me, I will check the name of who wrote this movie, because we should shout that.
Marry a girl from London town, you know you can trust them. They'll darn your socks and wash your mean trousers if you bust them. All good cooks and they got good looks and they won't leave you a dance. I'm gonna find a London girl if I get off a chance. Give me a London girl every time. I've gotta find one, I made up my mind. Give me a London girl every time. I want a London girl.
Yeah, so this movie was written by Joe Esterhaz, who also wrote some other stuff with Paul Verhoeven, specifically Showgirls.
That tracks. Yeah,
He also wrote Flashdance, I'm seeing here.
Okay, that's a bit of a different vibe, but okay. So the story of this movie, I mean, I will condense it down, but do you think the story of Basic Instinct is any good, Aiden?
No, I think it's a load of old shit, mate. And one thing that I wanted to flag up straight away is, as you say, Catherine or Sharon Stone. Let's just call her Sharon. Sharon is a
Shazza.
Big Shaz. She's a crime author in this, and one of the key kind of pieces of intrigue is that the geezer who got murdered at the start, Johnny Bars, which is a fantastic name, by the way.
Absolutely.
I'm obsessed with names like that. No, I just want to, as a shout out to our co-host Abdul, me and him watched a similarly filthy 90s thriller, The Devil's Advocate, relatively recently. We became obsessed with a character in that whose name is Eddie Barzoon, which is I think Johnny Bars and Eddie Barzoon are on a similar level of just fantastic names, but it's just sleazy background characters. Anyway, that aside, so she's taken him for questioning on the murder of Johnny Bars, on the basis that she's she was his lover, and also wrote a murder scene in her book that was very similar to how he got killed. And she basically makes out like, alright, this is like the fundamental building block of this movie, is that she's the suspect because of this, right? And then as it goes along, they uncover like several other people have died in her wake, all of which she translates into scenes in her books in some way. Which is kind of it's an element of the film that kind of goes by the wayside a little bit, but it's introduced because it becomes more about the sexual relationship between her and Michael Douglas. But like, the premise of this, that she has an alibi for committing the murder because she wrote it in a book, which is explicitly stated. She's like, I wouldn't be stupid enough to carry out a murder that was exactly the same as one that I wrote about in a fictional novel. Now, and they just buy that as like, yeah, it's a perfect alibi. It's like, no it isn't. Hold on a minute, no it isn't. Like, that if anything, that would incriminate you, surely. Like,
but she's a hot woman.
Yeah, and to be fair,
they have no reason to not believe
she does
her.
then flash her minge, which obviously means...
She does.
Obviously means that, we can no longer question you at this point, man. Thank you, good day.
And that scene in particular is more famous than this movie.
Yeah, the oft-parodied...
People know this.
I mean, I even saw this scene parodied in, what, was it Deadpool 2, relatively recently? They parodied this scene.
Yeah.
You know, his like body's regrown. He's got like little baby legs.
Yeah, people are still referencing this scene. Yeah. And I suppose, like, for its time, definitely shocking. At least.
I mean, it's still quite shocking now.
I can't really think of any other mainstream movie doing that.
This is one of these movies that could only exist in a pre-9/11 world, because nowadays you couldn't see an actress like you couldn't. Who's the big actress these days? Let's think about this.
Well, I mean, I was about to say, like, you got someone like Scarlett Johansson, but she went full frontal and under the skin.
Yes,
so
I guess. I'm trying to think what the equivalent would be, because like
tastefully,
because Sharon Stone at this point, like, this is the movie that makes her. This is still her most iconic film.
Yeah, like, this is what everyone remembers.
Like, she was in Total Recall before this and a few other things, but obviously another Paul Verhoeven masterpiece. Consider this other boards, but this is the movie that kind of makes her a star, or at least is the movie that kind of cements her in the public consciousness. I mean, it's obviously. I mean, I would also shout out my favourite Sharon Stone film, which is The Quick and the Dead, the Sam Raimi picture.
I thought you were going to say Catwoman.
I forgot she was in Catwoman. But,
she is in Catwoman.
But no, I would shout out The Quick and the Dead, the Sam Raimi Western, excellent film. I'm just going on a sidetrack because I like this film more than Basic Instinct. But that is a movie that has Sharon Stone, young Leo DiCaprio, Keith David up in this motherfucker, my man from Aliens, Bishop, what's he fucking called?
Oh, Lance
Henriksen. Thanks, sorry, it's so hard today. Lance Henriksen, Gene Hackman, and the list doesn't stop there. It's an insane movie that no one saw at the time, but when you see the opening credits, you're like, how the fuck is this not the most famous film in Sam Raimi's back catalogue? Because every single actor is in this movie. It's incredible. Anyway, that's The Quick of the Dead. We'll talk about that another time, I'm sure. But to my point about Sharon Stone, she was kind of up and coming at this point, a little bit of a, not exactly a no-name, but kind of not someone who'd... Because even in Total Recall, like, she's a big part in that, because she's the duplicitous wife of Arnold. But she's not the main antagonist, she's not the main love interest. She's just kind of a memorable side character, but a side character nonetheless. And I think she'd done some like TV and stuff before that, but
she was in a Wes Craven movie. She's in Deadly Blessing.
Anyone can get into a Wes Craven movie. I mean, goddamn.
That's true,
All you need to do is...
No disrespect to Big
Wes Craven.
No
disrespect to the man, but like, come on now. If you turn up with your own food, you're allowed to be in the movie, and you'll be wearing your own clothes. Yeah, but actually, interestingly about this, so Michael Douglas, when he finally accepted the role for this movie, because basically they pitched this to just about every actress in Hollywood. I mean, and they all turned it down, I would assume, because of the nudity. I mean, I was seeing Kathleen Turner, Michelle Pfeiffer, basically Kim Basinger was Michael Douglas's suggestion. There were, basically anyone who was an attractive white female.
Weird if it was Kathleen Turner, wouldn't it? Just because obviously, like, the movies that her and Michael Douglas had done previously.
Yeah. I mean...
like, Family Pictures?
Yeah, Romancing the Stone and so on, yeah.
Romancing Earth.
Shit.
Right.
I mean, to be honest, I think this movie would be kind of awesome if it was Kathleen Turner, but that's another story for another day. But yeah, it's kind of funny because Michael Douglas kind of didn't exactly refuse to work with Sharon Stone, but was kind of like saying... he took a lot of convincing, I was reading, because he basically thought, oh, well, she's a nobody. We need someone who's on my level of star power, or this movie's not going to work. And it's kind of incredible, because when you look at that list of people, you think, like, what was this movie? It's like early 90s, right?
92, this was back.
And you kind of think, Michelle Pfeiffer, that makes a certain amount of sense. Kim Basinger, Kathleen Turner, all these people make a certain amount of... Although I did read Verhoeven pitch this to Meg Ryan, which is... That's a hell of a move.
Yeah. At this point in time as well.
I love your romantic comedies. Would you like to be in a sexy picture? Yeah, that's going to continue with the rest of this episode, just so you know, listeners.
Do you want Michael Douglas to chow down on you? Vigorously.
I think it would be good if Douglas ate your posse in a movie. It's kind of turned into Sean Connery again.
I feel like that's what my one was. We'll run with it.
Well, yes, Tom Jones is also Sean Connery in the Kino verse.
Is Paul Verhoeven secretly all of these people?
Yeah, I think so. Hello, it's me, Paul Verhoeven. What was I saying? Oh, yeah, so basically it took a lot of convincing for him to work with Sharon Stone in this, and they did extensive screen tests and all this kind of thing. Because Paul Verhoeven kind of did pitch her over and over again, and, Michael Douglas was kind of not having it. Until he did. And it's kind of wild to think about that now, because this is the Sharon Stone movie now, right? Like...
Yeah, and it's her movie, and, like, her performance is... I'm not going to say her performance is, like, utterly brilliant, because it's a bit odd in places. She's got she makes some choices in some places that I don't quite get, but, like, there's scenes where she is genuinely really quite great in this.
She is playing it for camp. She plays
Catherine well.
I think that's the thing. She's playing it for camp, as she so often does. And I think that's kind of the way you can get around this movie, because this is why I think when you look at that list of actresses that there's even, if you go on the Wikipedia, there's even more, famous actresses of the early 90s who were considered for this role. But, like, I think the only one I could really see them getting away with is Kathleen Turner. And that's mostly based on her and Crimes of Passion, to be honest. Like,
Yeah, that's exactly what I was thinking of. Because, and again, like we've mentioned Crimes of Passion before on this show, but if you've never seen it, you should. Just purely for the opening shot, which is a close-up of Kathleen Turner doing her acceptance speech as the new Miss America, and we slowly pan out to discover a man just going down on her because that's his fantasy, to go down on Miss America. It's a 10 out of 10.
Absolutely.
Just for that
fucking
scene.
wild movie, and we've mentioned him.
It's so.
We've mentioned it in
good.
2 episodes of this series so far.
We're gonna have to cover it.
Maybe
That's
that'll be a
the
bonus
problem
episode in the next hiatus. We'll do Crimes of Passion just as a one-off. Let's make Beth. You know what? Let's make Beth watch Crimes of Passion.
Should we? No. Let's do sexy Kathleen Turner movies. We do Crimes of Passion and Who Framed Roger Rabbit.
Look, and any movie with Kathleen Turner, it is a sexy Kathleen Turner movie.
I mean, Serial Mom is a very sexy movie. Yeah.
Look, you know, people always say this about Kathleen Turner. Oh, she was beautiful, but she didn't age well. I disagree. I think she's a MILF.
Step on me, Kathleen Turner.
And even if she, even she doesn't need to age well. She's got that incredible voice.
That is true.
Anyway, less talk of...
Enough about Kathleen Turner's lovely, lovely voice.
Enough talk of... we're getting a bit hot under the collar, but... let's call it down by talking about Sharon Stone.
Wow. Okay.
I mean, that's not going to work, is it? All right, let's think of Michael Douglas. Think of Michael Douglas's naked ass. Okay, we're back. We'll calm down.
You see a lot of Michael Douglas ass in
You
this
see
movie.
far too much Douglas ass. Now, this is something I want to pitch to you. We'll get back to the plot of this movie in a minute, but so this is a movie that I was trying to watch from the perspective of like, what would it have been like to see this at the time? And I just can't quite fathom it, because I can't imagine a world where Michael Douglas, respected actor though he may be, is a sex symbol or a sexy actor in any way, right? And I know in this movie he's playing a greaseball, but also like, I think that's what makes this movie feel kind of off to me, is like, he is so unappealing in this movie.
Especially in that sweater.
That sweater. And I like, look, no disrespect to the man, clearly, yeah, I'm not trying to say he's a bad looking man or anything, he isn't, but like, this is something like his kind of clenched jaw performance is just kind of like off-putting. And I mean, maybe this comes to your point of like the movie is almost like a parody of film noir in a way. Like it's exaggerating.
I think that's kind of how I view it. Yeah, I think it's so ridiculous in parts. Like, yeah, the whole relationship between Catherine and Nick is patently ridiculous. Because, like I say, she's using him to as like the basis for her new book, which is completely based on him, and sort of delving into the plot a little bit.
Which, by the way,
discover
illegal without the person's consent.
Very much so. But then again, nobody really cares about the law in this movie.
They certainly don't.
Detectives seem to care
They certainly
about the
don't,
law.
because when he starts buffing her, the other cops are not like, you shouldn't. They're not like, you shouldn't be doing this because it's illegal. They're just like, you're so crazy, you're always chasing after skirt. And it's like, okay.
Yeah, they're not bothered about the legality. They're more like, oh, you're being a massive perv, or she might actually murder you.
Yeah.
Like, that's all they're really bothered
There's
about.
no point where anyone's like, well, that is gross misconduct. I mean, that should be the title of this movie, to be honest, gross misconduct.
Gross misconduct. I mean, that's actually true as well, because, we then find out the reason why Nick is so susceptible to Catherine's seduction is that, he's quite troubled himself. He's divorced, and he also manages to keep his job after shooting 2 tourists whilst deep undercover and absolutely off his fucking bonts on cocaine.
Yeah, that is wild, right? Because they're doing the whole thing where it's like, oh, he went too deep undercover, he got addicted to cocaine, blah, blah, blah. And he just shot a bunch of people in a cocaine-fueled frenzy, I guess.
And only gets away with it because the woman in internal affairs who's like the therapist or the psychotherapist.
Yeah, she's like the
counselor. Yeah, within his division. He's just shagging her and has been for a while.
And everyone knows about that as well. Everyone knows about that.
Yeah.
And yet that's just like fun. Because there's a bit where one of his cop buddies is like, oh, I swear he only started shagging her to get internal affairs off his ass. Doesn't say shagging because it's not a 15-year-old British boy, but...
No, that's true. That's true. Or, 2 approaching 30 podcast hosts.
I'm going to be 29 for another 2 years.
Yeah, no, I actually agree with you. No, I'm no longer gonna call this movie Basic Instinct. It's gross misconduct from that point on.
It's not quite as like sexy a title. Gross misconduct.
So I'm just gonna sort of breeze through the plot. Just
We
so we
have
can get
kind
more
of
to talk about the movie.
we have kind of glossed over before we get into the plot. We have kind of glossed over the iconic scene, which I think the listeners will want us to dissect.
Yes, we should. So when Catherine is brought in for questioning, we've talked about it a little bit, but we'll go into
it even further.
We shall. So what transpires is Catherine agrees to be questioned, and she's very calm and collected about it, like she is throughout most of the movie.
She takes a lie detector test, right? That's the.
She does, yeah. She agrees to take a lie detector test, which she passes with flying colours, because of course she does, because she's a fucking psychopath.
Yeah, which by the way is why lie detectors aren't used. Because
yes, because you can
famously unreliable. Yeah, and interesting point about this movie though, or not, kind of tangentially related, might be how Catherine beats a lie detector, given what a randy little bitch she is. But famously, well, maybe not famously, but the American and British Secret Services in the Cold War trained their operatives to beat lie detector tests. Do you know how? By thinking of erotic material and sex. Because supposedly that raises one's blood pressure in such a way that it will just throw off your test scores entirely.
I suppose, yeah, because it'll keep you at like a constant sort of fluxation.
So
right?
basically,
really
having a massive stonk on will help you. Which probably explains how James Bond gets away with so much of his antics, but there you go.
That's true, actually, yeah. So if you're ever caught and you're subject to a polygraph, just get a chub on. Save your life.
Just think about some pussy. Or some dick.
Whatever you're into.
Or some...
Even some bussy.
Just some bussies or some butthole. Oh no! He's coming over! He's coming over! Boing, 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 boing. How many times I've got to fucking tell you stop saying bussy on the fucking podcast?
We will never stop saying bussy.
It's hard to sell. It's hard to sell a movie podcast seriously when the hosts say bussy every fucking episode. All right.
Well, that's why it's your job to sell the show.
You don't get that with Mark fucking Kermode. All right, see you later. Boing, boing, boing.
Mark
boing.
Kermode says bussy all the time.
Yeah, they just cut that out.
Is that slander?
Libel, I think.
The big famous scene for this movie is where Catherine is brought in for questioning, she, before they bring her in, she has to change into something more appropriate. And
this
so
is quite early on in the movie, right? This is like Act 1.
Yeah, it's really early doors, actually. Yeah. I've sort of remembered it being much later, but no, it happens at least sort of like 15 minutes in.
I think maybe 20 minutes in, but it's pretty near the...
Yeah, it's pretty early. Yeah. I mean, it sets the tone. I mean, the opening scene sets the tone.
It's basically like the scene after she's introduced, pretty much.
Yeah, so they bring her in for questioning, and so Michael Douglas has a chance to perv on her beforehand when she's getting changed, and she intentionally only just puts a dress on. She doesn't put any underwear on, and we're very explicitly shown that. So then when she goes in for questioning and she's sat there, and she gets a line of the movie that I've always quite enjoyed, where she pulls out a cigarette. It's like, "There's no smoking in here." She's like, "What are you gonna do? Charge me with smoking?" I was kind of like,
yeah. Then later on, they echo that when Michael Douglas is seen questioning, and he's like, "What are you gonna do? Take me in for smoking?" It's hilarious. Not quite the same effect.
No. And so during this scene, Sharon Stone's character, she is just, fobbing them off and sassing them, and, she's clearly not taking this seriously. Or is she?
Meanwhile, Newman from Seinfeld is getting a massive job out.
Everyone in that room is getting
I know, but...
Okay, Sharon Stone is sitting there seducing everyone.
I watch a lot of Seinfeld, and the fact that Wayne Knight is in that scene is hilarious to me.
And then we get the big moment where, whilst discussing the crime, she opens her legs and flashes her vulva directly at everybody, and then crosses her legs again, which effectively gets her out of that situation.
It does.
She's subject to a polygraph not long after that, and they just let her go.
I love all the close-ups of the sweaty men in that room as well. It's just the most grimy scene imaginable.
It's so sleazy, isn't it? It's so sleazy. And, it's one of those scenes that's so famous, and there is also like a degree of controversy around it. There's been disagreements between Sharon Stone and Paul Verhoeven as to how that scene came about and such. And there's it's not something that we can delve too deep into because obviously we don't know.
Yeah, I should say
really
if people are intrigued, basically, Sharon Stone claims she was kind of tricked into flashing her lady parts in that scene. Basically saying that she was wearing underwear when they shot it. And Paul Verhoeven was like, "Oh, your white underwear is messing with the lights. Can you just whip your knickers off?" Which is kind of weird to begin with. And then assured her that you'd only be able to see shadow when she crossed her legs. Supposedly, she didn't notice that this had happened. That you saw the full whack, so to speak, until she saw it in a test screening, and she slapped Verhoeven and walked out. According to her, according to Paul Verhoeven, this is simply not possible because the way the shot was, set up, the way basically she was told that this would happen. I think it's interesting because she is full frontal in other scenes in this movie. There's at least one scene where she's getting undressed and he's still, you see it all. So I'm kind of like, to me, I'm not entirely sure where I fall on this because basically, no one has come out to back up either side of this debate, is the thing.
Yeah, there's the two accounts of what's happened, and that's it. I mean, Paul Verhoeven and Sharon Stone seem to be on good terms, so...
And she even has... Even in her retelling of this story, she says, like, it was right for the scene. So I'm kind of like, well, I don't really know what to make of that.
Yeah, it's again, it's one of those things I don't feel I can truly comment on it in any sort of meaningful way.
I would say I find it kind of hard to believe, even in the early 90s, that a director of a relatively major film would be like, I'll just whip my knickers off in the middle of a scene. That seems a little... What I'm suggesting is I think there's a truth here that's somewhere between the two accounts. And as is so often the case.
Yeah, and it's one of those things. So, like, I feel like it was definitely worth mentioning that there's a lot of sort of controversy around this scene. And also just controversial generally, like, this was quite shocking for a major Hollywood movie at the time to do something this, like, brazen.
I mean, I suspect there's some sour grapes on Sharon Stone's part because this is the scene she's most associated with, right? Which...
Yes,
that is by the way, that's not a judgmental comment for anyone listening. That I completely understand her having mixed feelings about this. Even if it is just a case of she did the scene knowing that was what was going to happen and now slightly regrets it. That's completely understandable,
Yeah, I mean, it's for any actress, it's a lot to ask of somebody.
Yeah.
To do a scene like that, and I think outside of that, the rest of her performance in this scene is great.
Yeah.
Like, she's genuinely really good at it, and she sells that character really well in this scene. I think she falters a little bit throughout the rest of the movie, and she gets some emotional beats a little bit later on where she kind of shows her range very well. But she's dynamite in this scene, and the actual like leg uncrossing itself is so...
It's very brief.
Perfectly done. Yeah, it's very brief as well. Yeah, but it's she plays it so well as well. That's the other thing.
Yeah, I will say I think the character is kind of like, with the best will in the world that Joe Esther has, not particularly well written, because she kind of he can't quite seem to make up his mind as a writer whether she is this femme fatale or whether she's kind of like subject to her whims, or whether she's kind of like a victim of circumstance. Like, he doesn't quite seem to know if she's a serial killer or not. And I know that the plot comes down one way as we get to the end, but there's scenes in this where she's like in this scene where she's very like, oh, I'm the femme fatale and sexy, and then there's scenes later on where she's very like vulnerable to a point that if she is this sociopathic killer, she wouldn't be able to be. And it's kind of a weird flip-flop between the two, I find.
It's kind of... She's basically a melting pot of all of the most famous femme fatale characters, but taken to the most grotesque extremes. Like, she gets a little bit of everything to do, but they never quite settle on what she actually is all about. So from what I take from her is that she is, a murderer. I don't think she's a sociopath. I think she's kind of just like... she gets off on killing, I think, and I think she gets off on getting away with it as well. and she is very much like a creature of vice. Like, she loves booze, she loves drugs, she loves sex. Like, she's very much just like all about those kinds of things. So I think she's just kind of addicted to things like risk and adrenaline rushes and all that kind of stuff. And I think, well, let's put it this way. She's a very cruel murderer.
Yeah.
Her method of killing people is horrific.
Yeah, the ice pick.
Yeah, and it's honestly, like, the ice pick deaths in this movie really fucking like make me wince a little bit, because I'm like, oh, it's so horrible.
I will say that this film is kind of like, when I talk about the writing being not entirely clear, like, when I first saw this movie, and I know we're jumping around, we'll sum up the plot a bit more in a minute, but like at the end where they're having the last shag in the movie, and it kind of like, you know, you see the ice pick under the bed, and it's like, oh, she was the murderer all along. When I first saw this movie, I was kind of like, wait, what? Like, I was fully like, hang on a minute, I thought we cleared this up. I thought the other girl was the murderer. Like, and like, you know, I kind of I hold to that to some degree. I think this movie can't quite make up its mind. Because, I mean, to be fair, if you haven't seen Basic Instinct 2, which I'm aware you have, and I also, and for some reason I also have, if you haven't seen that, where it concretely is like, yeah, she's the serial killer, you could take the end of this movie to be like, oh, was she thinking about killing him? Is she not the killer? Is she like, there's some ambiguity towards the end, you know, or is it just like, you know, a cheeky gag kind of thing? Like, from the there is some ambiguity towards the end of this, where it's like, did she actually do any of the murders that she's accused of? Because we should say, as the movie goes along, we find that Catherine has this kind of like all these bodies in her wake, right? People she used to know, and then they've kind of turned up in her books and stuff like this. And she kind of puts it down to like, well, I base my characters on real people, like people like me, and you know, I come into contact with unusual people, and they, you know, they're often in unusual circumstances, so they often die in unusual circumstances. But obviously, as Nick's being drawn in by her, the whole thing is like, is she the killer? Is she not? We later find out that his other squeeze, is it Beth, the psychiatrist, also had a torrid affair with Catherine in their university days. And Catherine, I think, at one point is like, oh yeah, there was this girl, who we assume is Beth, as it turns out later, who became obsessed with her and started dressing like her. And basically, it sounds like it was a bit of a single white female scenario.
Yeah. Another slightly better movie than Basic Instinct. Right, so the long and short of it is that Nick and Catherine begin this torrid affair. Catherine's lesbian lover Roxy attempts to murder Nick. Tries to run him off the road because you discover that Catherine's girlfriend likes to watch Catherine have sex with other people, but she didn't take kindly to watching Nick and her have sex. So Roxy attempts to kill Nick and ends up killing herself in the process. You then also discover that another agent or detective, are they in the FBI? Where are they based?
No, they're just the homicide squad, I think.
Okay, they're just the homicide squad. I wasn't quite sure, to be honest. Again, I was a little bit asleep when I watched this. We're doing a great job of talking about movies this episode. You know that, right?
What's this movie again?
Gross misconduct. We already talked about.
What was this executive decision? What are we watching?
But yeah, you find out that another
listeners, it's so hot, and it was boiling yesterday when I was watching these movies.
Yeah. So yeah, you find out that another detective has clearly had some kind of interaction with Catherine because she knows a lot of things about Nick that would be in his personal files. So this detective, Nick finds out who he is. This guy then soon ends up dead, and obviously Nick is immediately suspected because of his like hostility towards him. We then go down this other rabbit hole where you find out about Beth and how she and Catherine knew each other and had like an affair. And then you're basically led to believe at the end that Beth is the one who's been doing the killings the entire time.
Right, yes.
And they the detectives buy it hook, line, and sinker. They find like the blonde wig and the ice pick and the like rain slicker thing from the department, and they're like, "Oh, it's definitely her." I'm like, "You guys not going to look further into this? Like, why would Beth kill these people?"
No, they're not. They're not very good at their jobs.
They're really not. They're too busy like being like misogynist pervs throughout most of the movie.
Yeah.
and they just kind of go, "Oh, I guess you never really know a person." I'm like, that's awful police work. Like, you can't look any further into
I do
this.
feel quite sorry for the character of Beth, because not only does she get mugged off by Catherine, she gets mugged off by Nick, gets raped by him at one point. But
yeah, that is a strong scene.
Yeah, that's a fucking wild scene in this movie, where, like, okay, so it's established that they have a consensual sexual relationship with very, like, on and off. But he basically turns up at her house and just, has his way with her, while she's quite clearly being like, no thanks. It's a tough scene. That is a scene where I would question Verhoeven a little bit and be like, why is this in this?
Yeah, I get that. Like, the idea is that it's it comes just after he's first met Catherine, and it's supposed to obviously be implicit of things to come, but it's just a deeply unpleasant scene.
Yeah, and it's especially weird because later in the movie, Beth kind of like is like kissing him and just treating it like it's normal. And it's like, okay, because they even have that scene where he's like, "Oh, when we were making love," and she's like, "You weren't making love," and it's like, okay. That's a little mild for what's going on here.
For what happened, yes.
Yeah, and that is definitely a scene that I'd be like, touch problematic.
Yes. But no, at the end of the movie, we're essentially led to believe that Beth is the one who's done all these killings, and you get the shot at the end where you discover the ice pick under the bed. I mean, it's pretty clear-cut to me throughout this entire movie that Catherine is the killer.
I just don't think it makes a lot of sense, though. That's the thing for me. It's like...
Well, this is what I said. In my intro, I said that this film goes down, has some implausible twists. And there's so many like red herrings and things that they pile on top of Catherine. It's like she's so clearly the killer. Like, from the first moment you see her, she is the killer.
Also, that's why she shouldn't be the killer, right? Like, if this is a...
Yeah, exactly.
That's why whenever I watch it, I'm like, well, she can't be the killer because it's so obvious that she is. Right? Like, it's the thing of, like it's, it's the cliche of, like, the butler did it, because it's always like, it's the character you don't expect. But this movie's basically just going, like, she's the killer, and the twist is, she's the killer. And it's just kind of like, alright. good movie, I guess.
Also, like, how could it not be her?
Well, this is the problem. This is the problem I have with this movie from a writing perspective, and I don't want to be one of the people who's just obsessed with plot logic, right? But every time I've seen this movie, I'm like, it actually kind of makes more sense to me that all of these are just random happenstance that just revolves around her. Because some of the killings are quite like, how on God's earth did she get away with this? Because even the initial murder, even in 1992, they would have been able to pick up forensic evidence from that scene. I'm sorry.
This is what I have always said about this movie. Like, how did they not? Like, especially because in
literally,
that scene,
in the first scene you meet Nick, they are looking at a cum-splattered seat at one point, right? They're just looking at cum splatters. So these...
They're using a UV light. There is just cum everywhere.
And you go, how on God's earth has she not been caught? I know this is kind of like being obsessed with the plot logic at the expense of maybe the artistic merit of the film. But to be real with you, I don't know that this film has a lot of artistic merit. I mean, it's entertaining, I'll say that.
Definitely.
There are long stretches where it is quite boring, in my opinion. And that's all the kind of shoe leather stuff of, like, we're investigating. And I think that's the problem with this movie, is like, there's no point when you're watching it where you're like, oh, she's not the killer, you know? Unless, like me, and you're used to murder mysteries, you're kind of like, well, it can't be the most obvious suspect, because what would be the point in this if it was the most obvious suspect? That's the only thing that ever stopped me from thinking that she was the killer, is like, I've seen films before, it's never the person you first expect. This movie's like, no, actually, it just is.
Yeah, and I think on some level, maybe it is trying to... Like, I'm convinced it's a parody. I'm convinced it's
Well, this is the old Verhoeven problem, isn't it? Where sometimes he just makes a bad movie. And people like us are just sitting around being like, oh yeah, but actually it's like, what's the satirical intent here? Blah, 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 blah. Like, sometimes, he just makes a bad one. And in my, may I direct you towards Showgirls, which...
Yeah, that is turgid.
And that is turgid's a good word for it. But this is a movie that in recent years people have been trying to convince the world is a spoof, is satire, is high art, masquerading as trash. And I would simply just say, Showgirls is a piece of shit. I'm sorry.
Yeah,
it always has
really
been.
is.
Always will be.
Yeah, and I think Basic Instinct is only a couple of steps above
Yeah.
Showgirls. I mean, I like Basic Instinct on some level. I don't think it's like a particularly good movie, and it's not one that I care to watch every so often, but whenever I do watch it, the bits that stand out to me, like basically all the real like pure Paul Verhoeven stuff in it really stands out to me. All the murder scenes are just like ridiculously over the top. The sex scenes are like still to this day some of the most fucking graphic shit you'll see in a movie. Like that scene where Michael Douglas is chowing down on Sharon Stone, I would not be surprised if he was. I wouldn't be surprised if that wasn't genuine, like genuinely.
I mean, look, we know if there's one thing we know about Mickey Douglas, it's that he loves to chow down. I mean, look, when
almost died for it, mate.
He was willing to die for it. I mean, if people don't know what we're alluding to, young Mickey Douglas, or old Mickey Douglas, I guess, these days. Obviously, he's married to Catherine Zeta-Jones. Still is. I believe they had a separation at one point.
Lucky man. Lucky man.
Several years as junior. But they had a separation at one point, but I think they're back together after the cancer. But
I think so, yeah.
Yeah, so yeah, what we're beating around the bush there. Michael Douglas had throat cancer, and there's a legendary interview he gave at the time when he blamed the fact that he went down on his wife too much for his throat cancer. Which, by the way, there's some truth in that apparently. That if
yes,
can cause that.
Yeah, it's to do with HPV. There's been some studies that have said that certain strains of HPV can cause cancer in the throat through oral sex. Like that is so. That could be true.
I like the fact that he felt the need to announce that.
Why wouldn't you?
I mean, to be fair, if I was about to die and I could, claim in a legally irrefutable manner that I went down on Catherine Zeta-Jones several times in my life, or several hundred times in my life, you know what? That's a decent enough epitaph. I guess I would announce that to the Associated Press.
And it did also inspire one of my favourite ever lines in Scream Queens, which is...
Yeah, drop the line. Boom.
Just drop the line. Because Billy Lord's delivery of that is just wonderful.
So
I think we've talked about Basic Instinct.
Big shout out to Mickey Douglas there, the Michael Douglas himself, a sex-crazed maniac in real life, acted this movie.
So Aidan, Basic Instinct is it
Hank
Kino or is
him
it
himself? Yeah, by the way, just as a side note, whoever at Marvel made the call of casting Michael Douglas as Hank Pym in those Ant-Man movies, you deserve a raise. Perfect casting. And Michelle Pfeiffer's in there playing his wife, right? That's another
yeah, she is. Yeah.
I'm just going to say it. We slag off Marvel a bit on this podcast. I like the Ant-Mans.
Yeah, no, the Ant-Man movies are good. I was surprised by the second one, actually.
They're fun.
I wasn't enthused to see it, really.
They're fun. That's my take on the Ant-Man. I'm looking forward to Ant-Man 3 more than probably any of the other Marvel tasks. That aside, you asked me Kino or Inferno.
Yeah, I feel like we've just talked around Basic Instinct to the point where there's just not much point delving that far back into it, because this is a very shallow movie. Yeah. We may as well be shallow.
I think we've said all I really care to say about this movie. So
yeah,
I'm going to have to put this in the Inferno. This is not a good movie. I mean, the only thing that will... You know what, if we can do a partial Inferno, what we'll cut out of this is Sharon Stone's performance / career, which this movie made. We'll extract that from the rest of the movie. Because that's the thing about this film. When it's the Sharon Stone show, it is highly entertaining. When she's not on the screen, it immediately takes a nosedive into kind of boredom. And that is not a slag off on any of the actors who are in this. Obviously, Newman is great from Seinfeld. But also...
Mr. Wayne.
Mr. Wayne, also from Jurassic Park, of course. Amongst other things. Yeah, and obviously Michael Douglas, what needs to be said, a fine actor. But
a fine actor, maybe not my choice for this movie. I will throw that.
Yeah, I think the problem with Mickey Douglas in this movie is he's playing such a sleazeball, and he's playing it in the sleazy Michael Douglas asshole way. Because the thing is, Michael Douglas's whole thing is like he plays assholes. That's his entire thing, right? And sometimes, with varying degrees of likability. That's why he's so perfect for Hank Pym, because Hank Pym is a massive asshole. But he has that quality of an asshole-ish actor where he can... I'm sure he's not an asshole in real life. I'm sure he's very nice in real life. But, I mean, we know he's a generous lover.
That's what I was going to say.
To the point where he almost died for it. Which, but you know what? Fuck it. Whatever I was about to say about him in this movie, I don't care for his performance in this movie. Do you know what? Fuck it. Big bucket of win. He's a winner.
That's almost enough for me to make me Kino this film.
It's the most Giga Chad thing anyone said while staring down throat cancer. I think it's just because the thing is, he also followed that. To be clear, he followed that up with "and I do it again." So, fair play to the man. Fair play to the man. Kino. I've given this a partial Inferno.
I'm gonna singe it as well. I think I still do take some enjoyment out of this movie. Like you say, when it's the Sharon Stone show, it is quite good, and it's got some really it's got the quite iconic scenes. I think the murder scenes are just gloriously gory and horrible.
It's like 2 hours and 10 minutes long. Is this movie?
Yeah, it's a bit too
long. It needs to be 90 minutes.
Yeah, trim it down. Make it like a lean 90 minutes. It might be a little bit better. The plot is nonsense. It's absolute nonsense. But it kind of keeps it at a level where it's just constantly introducing new twists that I'm like, do you know what? If this was sort of better thought out and more well realised and they kind of knew what they were doing with Catherine's character, this could actually be quite a good thriller. They need to delve more into Nick being as troubled as he is and why he's so easily led by Catherine as well, other than just, he had a drinking and drug problem and shot a bunch of people.
They kind of toss out there his wife killed herself as well. Like, they toss that out early on and it's like, okay, is that relevant or no?
It feels like an unfinished script, is what I would say. It's not a fully formed idea. I think the elements are there. I think that's why Catherine's character is so broad as well, because they didn't really have time to really kind of get the laser out and just really precisely.
Yeah, it doesn't feel feel particularly tight as a movie.
Yeah, and in a movie that's all about hardcore shagging. You need something to keep you coming back for the hardcore shagging, if you know what I mean.
I mean, what we're basically saying is this movie is... feel free to cut this out. What we're basically saying is this movie should be tight like Sharon Stone's ass, but in fact it's a little bit not tight like Michael Douglas's ass. Yeah? Is that acceptable?
I might keep it in. If not, we'll do an alternate take.
Okay, sure.
But enough talk about hardcore shagging, Aidan. Let's talk about the other one.
Yes. The movie Drive.
There's 100,000 streets in this city. You don't need to know the route. You give me a time and a place, I give you a 5-minute window. Anything happens in that 5 minutes and I'm yours. No matter what. Anything happens a minute either side of that and you're on your own. Do you understand? Good. You won't be able to reach me on this phone again.
Drive is Nick Winding Refn's 2011 crime neo-noir thriller set in a neon-drenched Los Angeles... I'll try that, but less shit. Set in a neon-drenched Los Angeles... Still shit that time. Let's try it again, one more time. Set in a neon-drenched nightmare vision of LA. That'll do. Cut out me saying that'll do, obviously. Drive tells the story of the enigmatic, nameless driver, played in iconic form by Ryan Gosling, who is a stunt driver for the movies by day, but moonlights as a getaway driver for various armed robberies by night. Well, he has a very strict set of rules about what he will and won't do on these escapades, which he sticks to with ruthless efficiency. There's some more to this plot that I'm going to think of how to put into words. Obviously, cut this out.
His relationship with Irene.
Yes. Yeah. The driver moves in next door to Carey Mulligan's Irene and soon starts up a relationship largely based on longing glances with her and,
lightly.
and establishes a dynamic with her son. Unfortunately for him, her husband, played by Oscar Isaac, comes out of jail and brings them into a whole world of shit. And I think that's a fair enough summation because we'll go into more detail as we go along.
That's quite a lot of the plot of Drive, to be honest. Like, it's not the most plot-heavy movie.
No.
It's more of a character piece, more of a mood piece, I would say.
So, Mark, what is your relationship with the movie Drive?
This is actually the first time I've watched it in about a decade, I think.
Sacrilege.
It came out...
Sacrilege. You're supposed to be a film bro.
Yeah, I know. I'd only seen it the once. I watched it whilst we were at university, because it came out around that time, didn't it?
2011. I just said that. Fucking hell, Mark.
Yeah, it's very hot, Aidan. Yeah, so I saw it. I didn't see it in the cinema, actually, which I always kind of regret. I wish I'd have seen it when it was in cinemas.
Yeah, I missed it in the cinemas as well, actually. It kind of flew under the radar a little bit here. Like, by the time I'd heard buzz about it, it was out of the cinemas. And I'd somehow missed that it was a Nick Winding Refn movie. Like, that's how under-advertised it was here, I think. Yeah. Like, I already liked Refn because of Bronson and...
yeah, which I've still never seen, actually. I've never actually got around to that one.
That's outrageous.
I know. I've only seen very few Winding Refn movies. I've seen Drive, I've seen The Neon Demon, and I've seen
Valhalla Rising, because we watched that in class.
We did. I remember they showed us that. That was great. I like that movie.
You've seen
so
it.
I watched
haven't
this...
you seen... did you say Only God Forgives?
I haven't seen Only God Forgives, actually.
That you should watch.
I might
you should watch that.
Bronson.
Most people don't like it, but you should watch that.
Yeah, I've heard it's got an interesting reputation, that one. I think because everyone saw that he worked with Ryan Gosling again and was expecting Drive Part 2.
Yeah,
and it's not that.
It kind of is, I would say. It's a movie that I think is great, that the rest of the world is like, what's wrong with you?
I mean, I personally, as you know, really, really love The Neon Demon, and that was very polarising when that came out. I think that movie's great.
Everything he's done after Drive is quite polarising for the most part.
Well, I think, to sort of touch on Winding Refn for a little bit, I think one of the things that a lot of people don't get about his stuff, and I think it applies to Drive as well, but not
so
to
we
the
should
same
we should
level
say for people who don't know, Danish auteur Nicholas Winding Refn, whose career kind of started with the... he might have done a film before this, but with the Pusher trilogy of crime films, that's a Danish trilogy. He's subsequently moved over to Hollywood and continues to make weird art films. But it kind of...
So continues. He hasn't made anything since The Neon Demon.
Well, he did his Amazon series, Too Old to Die Young, which I haven't made it all the way through yet.
I haven't. Again, I've heard rather mixed things about it.
I liked what I'd seen, but it's very ponderous. It's a show that I'd like to go back to at some point and kind of marathon in a day, because I think that's probably the best way to get through it. But
that's fair. But yeah, I think one of the things I'd say about him is that, like, a lot of people really kind of talk about his style, because that's the thing. He's all about, like, the style and the presentation.
Yes.
But ultimately, a lot of his movies, and Drive is kind of no different. When you kind of boil it down, they're very kind of like sort of trashy, pulpy kinds of stories. Like he tends to try and tackle genres of, like, if Drive was made in the 80s, you know exactly what it would look like. You know,
it looked pretty much like it does now. Yeah.
Yeah, it's just, but like the way he presents it is just, it's so polished and so clean, and you know, like there's a lot of attention to detail in like the actual presentation of the visuals. And again, like the Neon Demon is that times 10
to the extreme. I think
because again, and that's that's just like a trashy horror movie, but presented as if it was, made by Vogue.
Yeah, and when you see Winding Refn talk about his influences, he often kind of talks about like very, very trashy horror movies and kind of pulpy stuff. He also talks about like Texas Chainsaw Massacre being one of his favourite movies. All this other stuff. But at the same time, he talks about all these art films as well. He's good friends with Alejandro Jodorowsky, for example. In fact, I think I read that Jodorowsky baptized him as an honorary son, whatever that means.
That sounds very on brand. Yeah.
Yeah, I think Only God Forgives is dedicated to Jodorowsky, actually. But
okay.
Which interesting film to dedicate to anyone. That's all I'll say about that. Personally, I kind of he gets compared to Michael Mann a lot, and this film is definitely very reminiscent of Michael Mann.
Oh, for sure. Yeah, absolutely. I can see that.
Especially, I don't know if you've ever seen the movie Thief, which if you haven't, shout out to James Caan, by the way, passed away recently. Cracking film, my favourite James Caan movie, and my favourite Michael Mann movie. There, I said it. So yeah, that's an absolutely great film, and if you watch that and kind of have Drive in mind, it's not quite as exaggerated as Drive with the kind of high contrast lighting and everything, but it's you definitely see the DNA and the character. Although he's not as stoic as the driver, this main guy, the safecracker played by James Caan, he has this kind of he's very methodical. He doesn't really have a world outside of his criminal life. You kind of see the kind of building blocks of this film in that film, I think. Which is not to say that anyone ripped anyone off before people get overexcited. It's just to say it's just a very clear, and because also what that movie has, which a lot of the other Michael Mann films don't, which is why I would point this out as like that specifically as an influence on Winding Refn, is it has this electronic score running throughout, done by Tangerine Dream. And when you watch that with Winding Refn in mind, you do think, oh, okay, there you go. There's kind of the synthy influence there, kind of thing. Which obviously this movie, Drive, we should talk about a little bit more. Obviously, one of the things that people really remember about this movie, because we should say, kind of, as much as it flew under the radar in this country, it has gone on to definitely become like a film bro cult film, right?
Oh yeah, it's Drive posters have replaced Pulp Fiction posters in film students' bedrooms.
yeah, and kind of rightfully so. I think like this to me is like
absolutely,
one of the millennial classics. I think when we're not,
sure.
But when I say millennial classics, I mean films that came out when we were of age, not fucking punk movie or whatever.
Not like the shit we've been talking about the last few weeks.
Because this is a movie that like I think millennial cinephiles definitely would point towards in the same way that like Gen X cinephiles would point towards like Pulp Fiction. Is what I mean by that. But one thing that people always talk about with this movie is the soundtrack. So you've got Cliff Martinez on the score doing very kind of dreamy synthy stuff. Then you have all these largely Italian, it turns out, synth pop bands in the background. Obviously, famously, Chromatic's "Tick of the Clock" is used. They use that. It's used in the opening chase sequence. I think it's used a little bit later on as well. It kind of recurs a couple of times. And that movie and that song became, an advertiser's song of choice for about 10 years afterwards. Anytime you want to convey like slick, cool, modern, it's like, there's Chromatics again, cool. But also, there's the very iconic soundtrack. This whole movie actually kind of goes on because it's interesting because you can see this kind of feedback loop where obviously Nick Winding Refn loves his synth pop. He uses it in every movie. That goes right back to Pusher, which is interesting.
Which I've never seen actually.
I'd recommend it. Mads Mikkelsen's breakout performance as well.
If it's got Daddy Mads in it, then we're into it.
Because those are the kind of like these are the kind of Danish wonder kids, really, as Winding Refn and Mikkelsen. But interestingly, on Pusher, Nicholas Winding Refn kind of said, like, the reason he went for all this kind of, like, synth pop, this kind of 80s, 90s, like, pop music, basically, was because when he was kind of doing research and he, like, spoke to real-life Danish gangsters and criminals, he was expecting them to listen to kind of, like, hardcore, like, rock music and, like, metal and stuff, but they were all listening to, like, Kylie Minogue in their car. And he just found that juxtaposition kind of inherently interesting. There's
kind
of
something to lighten your day, ain't you? Like,
yeah,
can't all be like doom, gloom, and murder.
there's something kind of interesting about that, because Winding Refn's choice of electronic music, which goes all the way through his back catalogue, it's kind of like synth pop, because it's in Bronson, it's in this as well.
Yeah.
You kind of see this movement of synth pop that's directly influenced aesthetically by like Drive and by Bronson and all these Winding Refn movies, and it kind of becomes this weird feedback loop, which I find really interesting because I too like synth pop.
Who doesn't? Like, it's
Yeah.
good shit.
That said, we should talk about the movie a little bit more. So,
We should, yes. So I watched this, for the first time in a long time, and again, the only stuff I really remembered from it was the bits where it's just Ryan Gosling behind the wheel of a car, the soundtrack, because even though I'd only seen the movie once, so many songs from the soundtrack ended up on my playlist for the longest time.
Anyone who likes this, A Real Hero by
College. College, who are really great, by the way. I've listened to more College over the years.
And they will be that song will be stuck in your head for days after you watch this film.
Yep, and because they use it twice as well. they get their money's worth out of the rights for that one. And then you've also got Night Call by Kavinsky.
Yeah, which is my favourite.
Really
the kind of opening.
Yeah,
well, not quite the opening, because it's the opening credits too. Yeah.
Yeah. I've only said that might be the most iconic song from the movie, at least to my mind it is.
Yeah.
I think
Real Human Being gets memed more, though.
Yeah. It's a bit dream poppy, shoegazy, that song, isn't it? Whereas I think Night Call's just cool. Like,
it's so cool. I mean, there's one thing you can say about this movie is this is fucking cool. Like, it's
a cool ass movie, and the cast alone,
is
just mind boggling.
All right, we'll go through the cast and then we'll go through the plot. How about that? Because we'll talk.
Let's do that.
Yeah. So obviously we have the man himself, the Gosinator, Ryan Gosling as the driver.
An unnamed character,
Yeah, kind of riffing on this sort of... well, we should say, actually, before we get into anything, this movie is based on a novel by James Salas, which I have not read, but from what I've read about it, it's a James Salas novel. You know, he's a fine writer, but it's an airport novel, really. Like, from what I understand, it's an above average crime thriller.
It's a paperback for your holidays, yeah.
Yeah. And I think Winding Refn elevates it with the style that he chose. That said, Ryan Gosling as the driver. This, to me, and Ryan Gosling's a fine actor, and I think he's one of those actors where, you know, when you look back on certain actors and they're very of their time, so if you think, say, Steve McQueen feels like he's a very 60s actor, you know, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
Ryan Gosling feels like he's very of that 2010s. I know he's kind of covered from the 2000s to the 2010s to the 2020s.
Yeah.
But like, when I think of him, I guess because I think of this movie when I think of Ryan Gosling. Like,
it's the first film I always think of when he pops up. Although I imagine that's going to change when Barbie comes out. So.
Greta Gerwig's Barbie. Yes.
Which I'm weirdly excited for because I have no idea what the fuck it's about.
The only people I know who are seeing that movie are all men approaching 30 who are cinephiles.
Literally.
I've not met a single female who claims they're going to see this movie yet.
I'm there for it, man. As soon as I saw those images of them in the fucking spandex with the rollerblades, I was like, I am in for this movie.
Yeah. Also, shout out to Ncuti Gatwa, who's in that movie, who's going to be Doctor Who soon. Just saying.
Actor.
And it led to Ryan Gosling wearing amazing Doctor Who bootleg merch, which he got snapped in. Which, if you've not seen that
Ryan
picture...
Gosling's a treasure. If
you've not seen that picture, it's fucking great. Ryan Gosling with his like super dyed blonde Ken hair, just wearing a fucking bootleg Ncuti Gatwa Doctor Who shirt. It's so good. It's a powerful energy. Anyway, in this movie, the Gosinator, I think it's kind of like his iconic performance. Like, when he shuffles off this mortal coil, I do think that'll be in the first line of his obituary will be Drive, I think. Which is not to be more... In the same way that when Sharon Stone shuffles off this mortal coil, Basic Instinct will be in the headline, you know?
Yeah, Basic Instinct actress Sharon Stone dies.
Yeah, I mean, I guess with...
it is going to be that for Ryan Gosling, isn't it?
I guess with Ryan Gosling...
I would love it if in an ideal world, it'll be Barbie actor.
Yeah, I guess there's also the Notebook as well, I suppose. But Which is,
yeah, but let's face it. Well, that's what they're like. Certain websites aimed at certain demographics
will say
notebook actor.
All the ones we see on our feed will say Drive.
It's going to be Drive actor Ryan Gosling.
And like he's great in this movie, and considering that his character has very little dialogue, I think he shows what an actor he is throughout this movie. Because, this is kind of like, it's one of the things I've because I've directed a little bit. One of the things that I will say, when I've just worked with, non-professional actors, let's say, or semi-professional actors, is actors who act when they're not talking is another level of performance. And in this movie, with our mate Ryan, so much of the plot is conveyed, or like so much of his character's thoughts, and his character really drives the story. So much of what he's thinking and feeling is conveyed through his face, his facial expressions. And they're very minimal facial expressions. This isn't like a silent performance where he's mugging it up. Like, this is, a performance where he has very few lines, but he has to convey to the audience everything that's going through his mind. And as we go through the plot, I'll kind of, because I was watching this movie last night with that in mind, and kind of being like, I want to kind of talk about that a little bit, because I've seen this movie quite a few times. It's one of my favourites. One thing that really struck me this time, because I was trying to watch it from, as I often do when we cover it, trying to watch this movie from the perspective of, like, okay, if I was seeing this for the first time, what would be my thoughts, kind of thing. And that's just something that really struck me, because it was kind of hard to make notes as I was watching this, because, as I say, there's not a lot of dialogue in the film at all, really, and there's enough dialogue. It's not a silent movie, but especially with the character of the driver, so much of it is like these shots, almost expressionistic, of like him driving through the night, or him just kind of standing watching scenes unfold. And you see the kind of decision and indecision across his face all the time. And you see how you get a very clear sense of what he's feeling at all times, despite the fact that he barely ever talks, and despite the fact that it's not this. He's because Ryan Gosling can go big. We've seen him go big in other movies.
Oh. Yeah.
But in this movie, he is almost completely internal. And I think that's what really kind of registers with this film, is this idea of, like, he is playing this almost Clint Eastwood, like, man with no name character. He literally doesn't have a name. He's never referenced by name in this movie. And the credits list him simply as the driver. Which is true in the novel as well, from my understanding. He's just called the driver. But he kind of like... So I was thinking... I'm going on a bit of a ramble here, but I was thinking about this.
No, you go right ahead.
The thing that, like, Clint Eastwood does when he's the man with no name, and the Dollars trilogy, and what Clint Eastwood does in general, I suppose, is his whole thing is like he's a strong silent type. He doesn't speak, he acts. And you have this very, like, almost masculine archetype that he creates. This almost hyper-masculine archetype where he's like a real man in a world of fools kind of thing. And that's sort of what they're riffing on here with the driver. But I think what's interesting is, like, his non-verbalness actually serves to kind of underline his vulnerability more so than his... And he definitely has a violent side, and definitely has this dark side to him. But you see, like, he has these looks, like when he's looking at Irene, of like this complete, like, longing for her kind of thing. Later on in the movie when she slaps him for reasons we'll get into later, and he's just like staring at the ground because he's obviously consumed by shame basically for what's happened. But also he can turn on a dime in that way, where like he can really like menace people with that kind of quiet fury. I think it's a fantastic performance.
That's what I find so intriguing about his performance in this movie, is that, like, when you see him being the kind of soft, vulnerable side of himself, especially when he's around Irene and Benicio, he's almost like childlike and naive, and like, because I don't know about you, but I find any of the scenes where Ryan Gosling and Carey Mulligan are just awkwardly staring at each other, I find them weirdly hilarious. I get that they're supposed to, I know what they're trying to do, but it's just I'm convinced the laughter between them in those scenes is genuine corpsing, because they both look like they're about to just lose their shit at any point. Maybe it's highly controlled acting.
Yeah, I think it is.
But to me, it looks like they're both just losing their shit.
I think that's something that people kind of have to get over with this film a little bit. Is like, I don't mean like if it's not to your taste, it's not to your taste. But like, I think this is something you kind of have to tune yourself in with this movie. Is like, yeah, there's a lot of sort of being conveyed not through just chatting, you know. And I think that's like
it's just looks and
actually I think the benefit
good, but I just find it very odd and weirdly funny.
And I think there is part of it that's kind of, you know, it's funny. Like, I think it is supposed to be, you know, Winding Refn has a sense of humour. Like, these films are not completely serious. I mean, this movie is funny. Like, Ron Perlman in this movie is funny, for example.
Ron Perlman's performance in this movie is something.
Yeah. And I think the genius of this movie in terms of casting, it's very much like Oscar Isaac in this. He was not a big actor when they cast him in this. He is now.
He's great in this.
He is great.
He's
as
genuinely great.
Carey Mulligan's husband, Standard, which, by the way, fantastic name for a coach husband. Standard Gabrielle, yeah. I would even have the joke right when they first met. She apparently said, "Where's the deluxe version?"
Yeah.
But I think what they do that's quite clever and it's subtle is that Standard never shuts the fuck up. Like and that's kind of part of Oscar Isaac's acting, right? He kind of has that Jimmy Stewart thing, like he kind of naturalistic and kind of rambles a little bit. Pairing him against like the almost completely silent and just kind of vibing Ryan Gosling, I think that's where the genius of that kind of silent interaction thing comes in, because like I said, like Standard never shuts up in scenes that he's in.
Yeah.
Like, he's always yakking away.
Yeah.
And he's normally...
the driver actually gives Irene a sense of peace and calm and tranquility and emotion.
And you know, he never speaks unless he has to, you know.
Yeah.
It's not to say, like, because there's a couple of moments where he makes little jokes, like he has this bit where he says, you know, about his car not having any wheels and stuff. Or like when he's talking to Benicio, he's just like kind of, you know, talking to a kid, right? But,
yeah, I like the scene where he sat watching the cartoon. I'm assuming it's a cartoon of him. And he asks, "Oh, who's the bad guy?" It's like, "Oh, it's a shark." Well, are there no good sharks? I like that scene a lot. I think that's a really like well written.
That is an example of a scene with a lesser actor where, because that is quite frankly on the page that is a clunker of a line, because it's like, yeah, we get it, all right, he's morally dubious.
It's delivered so well.
But look, we should go through the plot a little bit, because we are getting sidetracked. I know we were going to go through the characters, but fuck it, let's just go through the story a little bit.
We're just too busy talking about how good Ryan Gosling is. That's all.
And that is the main event. You know, like how Sharon Stone's the main event in Basic Instinct.
Yep.
Ryan Gosling's the main event here, which is not to say that the other actors in this are no slouches, right? Like,
absolutely. Like,
we've got Albert Brooks in this movie, Hank Scorpio himself.
And when you consider as well, for the time, like Ryan Gosling wasn't exactly like a huge star when this movie came out, so to put him up against the likes of, you know, Ron Perlman, Bryan Cranston, you know, that's a tall order.
Yeah, Bryan Cranston. Really is. So we should let's briefly sum up the plot, because this plot is pretty nuts and bolts.
Yeah.
So basically, the movie opens, as we said, with the sound of chromatics in the background, but also, so we kind of see this initial getaway. I think this scene is just fucking awesome every time.
Oh, it's so just beautifully done, and like every shot, every editing choice, every soundtrack beat, everything is just brilliant.
Yeah.
Like, I was really quite taken aback watching it earlier for this.
It's edited to precision, and I think that's kind of true of this entire movie. Is like the movie almost kind of has this element where like you're so in the driver's psychology that the movie almost plays out as the driver sees the world in this very like mechanical, precise way that he does things. And like so, like yeah, like this starts from the opening scene where you have him, you know, on the phone where he's like explaining how he works. He says, you know, I don't carry a gun. I don't sit in while you're running the job. I have a 5-minute window. Within that 5 minutes, I'm your man. Anything either side of it, you're on your own. And then you kind of see him going down to Bryan Cranston's workshop, because Bryan Cranston is the guy who sorts out the cars. And, you know, they have the dialogue about, like, oh, you're going to pick the, you know, the car that... No one's going to be looking at this. It's the most common car in the city. But it's also well set up, because, like, when he's in his apartment talking on the phone about, like, this is how I do things, you see in the background he's watching the news, and you see that there's, like, a sporting event on, which then, as they're driving away from the robbery, he then drives into the sporting arena, and the guys will go their separate ways. So you see that he has this very, like... He's very in tune with the world around him, even though he's like this very kind of doesn't speak too much. He observes, and that's kind of
understands the city. You know, like he's part of the dark underbelly.
He fucking walked straight past the cops as well, because the cops start pursuing him.
He is brazen.
Yeah, he just takes his jacket off and like puts the cap on and just walks past them. which is a baller move, and we support that shit. But yeah, then basically the long and short of it is Bryan Cranston's character, who's the bar, because they do the stunt driving for the movies, of course. So he's kind of Ryan Gosling's sort of agent, boss, handler type guy. And you see that like they have a nice dynamic where it's made pretty clear that Bryan Cranston's character is a bit of a shyster, but also it's made abundantly clear that the driver is letting him get away with that. Like, I think that's the undercurrent of that relationship, right? Because like,
Bryan Cranston's character completely admits to exploiting.
to Irene, that he exploits him.
But he does. You can tell that he does care about him.
Yeah, I think you know that their dynamic is like he kind of lets him get away with it, because in that scene later on where he does freak out him, he's like, "Why you gotta fuck everything up, Shannon?" It's like that's the one scene you really see the driver like actually lose his cool a little bit, and you see that like there is this power dynamic there where when the shit actually hits the fan, Shannon, Michael. I almost said Michael Shannon's character. That's not right. What are we talking about? Bryan Cranston. He's like backs down from the driver at that point. So the long and short of it is, they want to get out of the stunt driving and presumably the armed robbery business, and they're trying to set up like a race driving business. And Shannon goes to Albert Brooks' character, who is a kind of a low-level mobster, I think we get the idea of, who's unfortunately partnered with Ron Perlman's character. And they kind of pitch them on this idea of like, hey, we could go into business as, doing this kind of race car driving, you could put up the money for us. And, I've got the cars, but now I've got the kid. Like, he's this excellent driver, he can, it's in his blood sort of thing. So that's kind of ticking away in the background. Meanwhile, as we've said, the driver kind of starts chirping Irene, his next door neighbour. And it's a silent chirps. But it's a chirps nonetheless.
It's a bit of an eye fucking, that's what I'd say.
Because we should say, for the benefit of people who haven't seen this movie, a lot of the scenes with Ryan Gosling and Carey Mulligan in this is them kind of softly staring at each other and not saying a lot. Which Mark finds hilarious.
And it worked. I just don't know what it is. I just think it's so funny. And again, you do get the genuine sense of giddiness from this as well. Like, I think it is brilliantly acted. It's just I don't know, awkward silences always make me laugh, and in this movie they really just fucking kill
I think it's because you find it awkward. I think is the thing. And like, you're certainly not the biggest complaint about this movie was people going like, oh, it's just people staring into the middle distance. I would argue, and maybe this is the benefit of I've seen this movie several times. If you're actually looking more at the expressions between them, there is this quite subtle like interplay going on. This is kind of why I regret not seeing this in the cinema, because I think on a big screen that would be interesting to watch. So basically, long and short of it is, they start up a relationship of sorts. I often see this referred to as a very chaste relationship, but it's actually my opinion that they are fucking like jackrabbits. It's just the movie doesn't choose to show us that.
Yeah, I mean, like, you only see them kiss towards the end of the movie.
Yeah.
Up until then, the only other kind of romantic interaction they have is there's a part where he's driving her through the town and they hold hands while they're driving. It's quite a sweet and innocent relationship that's juxtaposed against
I think it's
ultimately quite a very dark and ugly movie.
I think it's deliberately portrayed in that because it's kind of, it's Winding Refn is kind of, expressionistic in that way. Like, it's showing you how the relationship feels to them rather than the nuts and bolts of like, are they fucking or not kind of thing,
You especially get that when he takes Irene and Benicio out for the day and they just go skimming stones by a river, and it's almost like unrealistic. I would say it feels kind of false. But again, like you say, if you're seeing the movie through the perception of the driver, that is how it feels to him. Like, and also he does see it as kind of like the romantic ideal. Yeah, so I do think they do. I think he lays some pipe, to be quite frank, because the movie also makes it clear like he's never not at their fucking house. And, like, her friend comes in and she's like, oh, hey, man. And it's like, yeah, okay. And, like, that's the bit that to me is like, oh, okay, cool. That, like, she, like, clearly Irene's been like, look, I'm fucking this guy. Just don't worry about it, I've got to agree, because, like, you take one look at the driver, you go, he fucks. Like, he fucks like the wind. He fucks, like, with mechanical precision. And also, when they do show that kiss later on, when he gives her a little snog in the elevator, that's not a first kiss. That's not a first kiss. That is the kiss of a man that has lain waste to that woman many times.
Quite. But yeah, so, long and short of the plot. Standard, who is Irene's husband, comes out of jail. He got done for armed robbery, as it turns out. And the kind of, basically there's some guys putting pressure on him. The driver kind of, they want him to do a job. They want him to do a robbery. The driver decides, fuck it, I'll help this guy out because, I love his wife. Which,
and then they're going to come after the wife and kid next.
Yeah.
That's the thing.
Yeah, well, because that's right. Because when they beat Standard up, they hand the bullet to Benicio and kind of say, "Keep hold of it."
Which is that's a nice little touch. I like that a lot.
Yeah. So he decides, "Fuck it, I'm going to help them out to keep the wife and kids safe." I do like Bryan Cranston's line about a lot of guys mess around with married women. You're the only guy I know who does a robbery to pay back the husband. Which, I like that. And so obviously he agrees to be the getaway driver. Turns out it was a setup all along, and it was Ron Perlman who set it up because and we're introduced to Ron Perlman's Nino, who, by the way, what a great performance.
It's whatever they were giving Ron Perlman before takes.
I mean, he's crazy in this movie. It's like the bit where he sees the sports car. He's like, "That is one fat motherfucking pussy mobile, motherfucker." It's crazy. I also love the speech he gives later on when. Okay, so let's just gloss over the plot. Basically, the long and short of it is, it was a robbery gone bad. It was a setup. The driver was never supposed to be there. Standard gets whacked. Christina Hendricks is also in this movie. She's in
like 5 minutes.
She's in the robbery. Gets her head blown off for her troubles, and basically everyone's out to get the driver because it turns out the money he stole was from the mob. And Nino, so this is Ron Perlman's character, was setting this up because some mobster was moving in on their turf. Basically, is the idea. So he was going to set up this kind of fake robbery, take the money, and fuck everyone off. As it happens, all these things have gotten intermingled, and it's a big clusterfuck of a mess. Basically, the rest of the movie is the driver trying to kill his way out of this.
Whilst everybody around him succumbs to horrible, horrible fates.
Yeah, because basically there's a point where he goes back to get Irene and Benicio, and there's a guy there. And that's the point where the movie is like, okay, because that's when you have the iconic scene where they get into the elevator and the mobster's there waiting. Obviously, the driver knows the score, Irene kind of doesn't. And they have the iconic slow motion kiss, which then turns into the equally iconic moment where he stomps a man's head into a pulp whilst Irene watches.
I actually wanted to ask you about this because I've read some reviews of Drive in preparation for this, and there was something that I noticed that was quite consistent. What are your thoughts on the violence in this movie? Because it was criticised by a lot of people for feeling a bit out of place.
Yeah,
and I agree to an extent.
I would be interested to get your thoughts on it, but to give my thoughts briefly, I think it works pretty well for my money. I mean, the scene where Christina Hendricks' head gets blown off, which really is the start. I know you see Standard die before that, but that's kind of in a wide.
Yeah.
And it's kind of a moment of oh shit, it's not lingered on in the same way that the rest of it is. It's just kind of oh shit, we've got to get out of here kind of moment. The first moment of real gratuitous violence is when Christina Hendricks' Blanche gets her head blown off in slow motion, and then obviously the driver. He takes the shower rail off and rams it through a guy's throat.
Is it like a shard of glass or something?
No, it is
whatever
it's the pole from the shower rail.
Whatever it is, he fucking
takes it off and smashes it through the guy's throat. Yeah, and obviously then takes the shotgun and finishes the other dude. My thoughts on it are this. I think it works pretty well, and I think, bearing in mind what we were saying about the tone of the movie is almost dreamlike, and this is Winding Refn says this himself, the movie is a dream that becomes a nightmare, and I think bearing that idea in mind, where it's the first half has this very romantic, dreamy vibe to it, and then as we get into the criminal underbelly, it becomes this very overstated, pulpy, violent thriller. I think it works. I kind of reading some of the criticism, because I read some of this myself. I think people kind of felt it was like sensationalist for the sake of it, which I think is a little unfair.
I think like I'm a little bit on the fence. I feel like it's in places it might be a little too much, but somebody,
what would you think of as an example of too much in this movie?
Well, I mean, the bit where he stomps the dude's face in, like, you know, you could get the impression that he's killed him, but then we quite literally see his foot go through his skull, for example. And again, I say this as somebody who, you know, I'm a big fan of a really overly gory movie. Don't get me wrong, but I mean, I do think the blood and guts of this movie is like I say, it's sensationalist, but in a good way, I think.
Yeah.
But it at times it does feel a little bit at odds with the rest of the movie. You've kind of got this somewhat restrained crime thriller that's really kind of dealing with these like quite interesting and complex, albeit silent, relationships between these characters. It's just like Christina Hendricks gets her fucking head blown off.
I think it kind of has to feel at odds though. Like, I think this is just my take on the movie. I mean, this is obviously one of my favourite films. So I'm kind of think that it mostly works. I think when you think of like the head stomp scene. It's obviously like a famous bit. I think that scene really, it's that interesting juxtaposition where you go from this like hyper romantic, like when he kisses Irene as like a goodbye kiss, kind of like, remember who I am kind of thing, and like acknowledging the fact that he's going to do some real fucked up violence in front of her in a minute. Like that whole shot, like, it goes from just the normal lighting of the elevator to then like the lights kind of drop away so that they're spotlighted as they kiss in slow motion, and then it cuts to them fucking the guy. Like that whole juxtaposition, like the violence is ridiculous when he puts his fucking boot through the guy's head. But the whole scene is about that. Yeah, but that whole scene is about that juxtaposition. Is what I would say to the critics is like, if you like the dreamy romantic stuff, the whole point of that is to be contrasted to the horrible over the top violence, and vice versa. I don't think this movie works if you... I mean, maybe you could have had that scene where you just see him stomping the guy's head and it like kind of zooms in on Irene as she's watching. But I think that would have a different effect to... It would still be pretty effective, I suppose, but like... Yeah,
it serves a purpose, that's the thing. The head stomping really does serve a purpose to show that like Irene is seeing the true monster that he actually is. Because this is the thing, like, even though he's like seen as a good guy throughout, like... When you see the flashes of him being violent, like he is kind of a monster. Underneath it all. Yeah.
Well, that's something I wanted to get into actually. I mean, we don't have much more plot to discuss. He basically tracks everyone down and kills them. Not before. Well, he tries to make a deal with Albert Brooks, but it doesn't pan out, and he ends up killing him. Yeah, I mean, there's various ins and outs. Like he tracks down the guy who gave the bullet to Benicio, for example, and kind of dispatches with does what, because actually he doesn't kill him. Albert Brooks kills him.
He does, yeah. He smashes his hand in with a hammer, and again, like that to me is one of the violent scenes where I'm like, that feels in keeping with the rest of the movie. But it's still fucking horrible.
The long and short of it is, he kills Nino, and obviously Albert Brooks' character can't let that slide. And they have that great conversation at the diner where, not the diner, the restaurant or whatever it is, where they kind of is saying like, look, I can let Irene and Benicio go, but like you're going to have to live the rest of your life looking over your shoulder. Like it's not like whatever plans you have for the future, you've got to put them on hold, kind of thing. And this is after he's killed Bryan Cranston's character. Now that scene I could maybe see people saying is a little gratuitous, where Albert Brooks just kind of takes a straight razor and like opens his wrist with it.
Yeah, I'd forgotten about that.
That seems a little wince-inducing even from me.
Yeah, that's some... But again, that's some very, like, personal violence as well. Like, that's something that could feasibly happen.
Yeah.
I mean, not every day do you get your head blown off in a motel bathroom with a shotgun.
It's true. So basically that's kind of the long and short of it. Like, the driver survives, being stabbed by Albert Brooks, and just kind of drives off into the sunset. And we see that Irene is safe. That's basically the plot, right? So to kind
She's safe and pining for that dick.
Yeah, quite. So I guess, like, to me, and kind of talking about like the essence of Neo-Noir, I suppose, what makes this film interesting beyond the sensationalist elements is like it really is a story about people just making the wrong decisions at every turn, right? Because every character in this film just fucks up from start to finish, including the driver. Because, he's already living this double life when the movie starts, but then he decides to get involved with a married woman. And then when the husband turns up from prison and he's, pretty mellow about the whole situation, he does kind of say, like, there's that interaction they have where he's going to be like, oh, you've been helping Irene out, huh? It's nice, it's very nice of you. And you can tell that he's, like, trying to be the bigger man.
I need to highlight Oscar Isaac in that scene because it's such a fucking powerhouse display of his acting ability. You can see he does such a good job of maintaining that nice persona where he's talking to the driver, but you can see in the body language and just little subtle movements, you can feel the rage that's actually inside him. And Oscar Isaac just does this fucking incredible job of conveying both of those things simultaneously.
There's even that third element of, like, he knows he has to hold back the rage because he knows he can't do anything about it because ultimately, like, what are you going to say? Like,
like, he's, like, genuinely really intimidating in that scene as well. Like, I was quite in awe watching it, but then they immediately, like, emasculate him a scene or so later by showing that he's just had the living shit beaten out of him and he's kind of helpless and he has to then go to the driver for help. He has to crawl to the man he knows has been piping his wife. And I was like, I always thought that was kind of interesting as well. Like, they kind of set Oscar Isaac up as being this kind of villain. I was going to say Standard. They set Standard up as being the villain. And he's just completely just kicked off of that perch immediately.
Well, he's kind of
in favour of people who are far fucking worse than him.
Well, I think that's the thing with Standard, though, is, like, the impression I get with that character is, like I say, he's just a person...
He's all mouth.
He's all mouth and no trousers. Because there is also that great... There's a great interaction with them when they do the armed robbery later on, where I think the driver's in the car outside, obviously. He goes, see you in 5 minutes, and Standard goes, I'll see you in 4. Which I like the...
It's got to go one better.
The pointless dick measuring,
I want to highlight Christina Hendricks as well, because her performance in this is quite
she's
interesting
great.
as well.
This, But yeah, the one thing I wanted to say about Standard, like, when you get the backstory on him, which is kind of an interesting scene, because he reveals all that with the driver in the room, and that's, like, after he's had the shit kicked out of him. He has he has that whole speech about, like, when how he met Irene. She was, like, 17 at the time. He approached her, and, like,
I'd forgotten about that as well.
Yeah. And, like, that whole thing. I mean, that again is another beautifully acted scene, even from Carey Mulligan as well, where, like, as he's telling this story as, like, this kind of, like, oh, this is how we met. It's kind of a quirky, funny story. And you can see in her eyes, like, this man has essentially trapped her in this life, unknowingly, it would seem, unwittingly, but also, like, you see that interplay between, like, his denial as well, where he's like, and I think that's kind of what's so kind of compelling about this movie is, like, as simple as it is, there is this complexity to every character, even though there's no scene where anyone's like, here is my backstory. And in fact, with the driver, you never get the backstory. He's just some guy. I mean, you get the idea that, like, whatever made him move to LA, because we find out, he came kind of into Bryan Cranston's life out of nowhere. Whatever made him move to LA probably was not good news. That's...
No. And, clearly the one thing that he values in life above all else is cars. Like, not only does he drive them for both legal and illegal activities, he also fixes them for a living as well.
Yeah.
Like, he literally just walks into... he tells the story where he apparently just walked straight into Shannon's garage and demanded a job.
Yeah. And again,
big dick energy, we're here for it.
And again, I think, Shannon's a good example of what I'm talking about, where every character in this movie is just someone who makes the wrong decision at all times. Because he's this guy, he's always pushing his luck, is the impression you get from Albert Brooks, right? Because, like, he kind of takes us like, oh, it's Shannon, I'll let him overcharge me for this and that and all this. But we also learn that Nino, Ron Perlman's character, fucked him up one time because he was overcharging his buddies, kind of thing. And then we actually see that, like, he walks around with a leg brace, right? Like,
he shattered his pelvis, is what he says.
And obviously, like, but then again, you get this sense with Nino as, like, he's kind of this, I mean, as Albert Brooks says, this belligerent asshole with his back against the wall. You get the sense from this character, like, as much as he's, like, the comedy, oafish gangster to some degree, and you're supposed to, he's quite a hateable character. He has that great speech. It's like one of my favourite Ron Perlman acting moments, where he's talking about the mob, the Italian mob, basically, that we're trying to move on the turf. He uses a slur, but we won't repeat that. And he kind of goes, he has that line about, what fucking family? A family that still treats me like I'm some fucking kid that pinched my cheek. That whole, you get this idea of this guy, because they establish like he's Jewish, and they even have the line about, as is Albert Brooks, one assumes, Jewish in real life, so he must be in the movie. But you assume that, we see that, because Albert Brooks even has the line at the start about, what's a Jew doing running a pizzeria? So it's this guy who's like, so Nino is this guy who's like totally defined by trying to emulate this crime family that will never treat him as one of their own,
Yeah.
And even though you never meet this Italian mob that they talk about, you get that sense of like, this is why he's such, like, he's got a chip on his shoulder. He's such a belligerent asshole to everyone, because it's like he's got to establish dominance to everyone in the room.
Yeah, because he's just always been like just shat upon by those around him, and I think that's why he's so loud and I just love Ron Perlman in this movie.
And I'm always intrigued by how did those two guys, Albert Brooks and Ron Perlman, get to work together in this movie?
Yeah, they're very chalk and cheese, aren't they? Like, they're not two types you'd put together usually.
Yeah. And this is what I like about this movie. There's so much to unpack, even though, and I think it is a movie like you kind of end up loving it or you end up not really getting it. Because I know plenty of people who saw this and were kind of just like, oh, it's a fucking crime movie. I don't know what you want to tell me. And I think those people should put their phones down when they're watching films, for one thing. Because this is a movie that you can't watch if you're not paying attention to it. Because of that element of, the dialogue is sparse. And what dialogue there is often fairly inconsequential as well. Like, there are points where they talk about backstory, plot things, or whatever. But like all the dialogue between Irene and the driver is like, it's odds and sods. It's very like
it's just banal conversation, really, isn't it? Like if you were sort of fading in and out of this movie and you weren't watching the scenes where they just kind of stare at each other for like 25 minutes. You wouldn't buy their relationship at all, because you'd be like, how have they gotten to know each other? Like, it moves very quickly, but like you say, they do express a lot of their like affection and fondness for each other just through little glances and moments. And silence, or they bond in silence, which is
it's a very Scandinavian art film trait, really. Is the side like, I don't know if you've watched much Scandi drama, but there's a lot of that where it's like people have not said, like, it's more about what the characters don't say than what they do say. And that's very reflected in this movie, I think. Do we have any closing thoughts on Drive? I mean, I think we've talked about it quite a bit at this point.
I think the only character we've not really talked about is Irene, and I just want to shout out Carey Mulligan.
Glaring omission there,
because Carey Mulligan, she's just kind of great in everything she's in anyway. Like, even going far back as she's in the Doctor Who episode Blink, she's really, really good in that. Shame, she's really good in that as well. I just want to highlight Shame because that's a film.
It's a rough movie. I'll shout out Carey Mulligan. I think her role in this movie is, she's kind of the love interest that's being competed over more than is being involved in the plot itself. That said, I think she acquits herself well, and you get a real sense of her character's. You understand what attracts her to the driver, and you kind of, you also understand what attracted a 17-year-old to Standard to some degree. He is, you do, and she does a lot through, her eyes and her face. I think one of her best acting scenes in this movie, and we kind of alluded to this scene earlier, is like after Standard's been killed, and obviously the police have been around to question her about it. The driver kind of shows up, and he's like, I've got the money. We could go, like, you, me, and Benicio could fuck off, basically. And, he kind of comes clean about, like, I was there, blah, blah, blah. And she gives a classic film noir slap across the face. But, like, Winding Refn lingers on her face for just a fraction of a second longer than you normally would in this kind of movie. And, like, she is able to convey that, like, sense of just anguish, because she loves this man, but she fucking hates him at this moment, and you see that kind of just that mix of emotions where it's like, obviously she wanted to leave with him before all of this happened, but now you put her in a position where,
well, you see her like ideal vision of what they could have is just completely like destroyed, because ultimately he's just become standard.
He's just like
yeah. Ultimately, she's just learning that no matter what, she's always going to be let down by men, which is a fucking horrible thing to take forward in your life.
But in her case, it's true, because she thought this guy was different, and it turns out he just kind of wasn't. He's just kind of more confident. He's just more confident.
In some ways, worse.
Yeah, because you never get the sense the Standard's a killer.
No, I don't see him stomping a man's face in.
Yeah. Admittedly,
let's put it this way: Standard is face to face with the man who has been piping his wife while he's in prison and doesn't stomp his face.
Yeah. And, well, to be fair, we don't know that the driver has committed violence before he was protecting Irene, I guess. But
I very much get the impression he has for the scene that it probably might be my favourite scene in the movie, just for Gosling's performance, where he's sat in the diner eating the cake or dessert or whatever it is, which again feeds into the thing that I was saying about where he's very childlike in the early stages of the movie. Like, whenever you see him eating, he's never eating like actual food. It's always like, he's eating cake and stuff like that, and the way he bonds with Benicio is very much like he talks to him on the similar level. He doesn't talk to him like an adult, I guess. He kind of just talks to him like a kid talks to a kid.
I don't know, because that first scene with him and Benicio, where he's fucking around with the car or whatever, and Benicio's just watching him. That's very symbolic of like a father-son dynamic, though.
Yeah, I guess so. Yeah, I mean, I don't know. He just comes across as very childlike.
No, I agree with you. He has this kind of like boyish,
especially when like he's just sort of grinning at Carey Mulligan and stuff, like a love-struck puppy.
Yeah, and like
then Gosling portrays that so well.
And there's even a moment where Bryan Cranston's like, he kind of sets up him, giving him a lift home. And there is a great moment where Gosling is like a teenager who's kind of like, shut up, Dad. He's kind of, wanders off.
He's like, he's really bashful in the early parts of the film. And then you get that scene where he's sat eating cake or whatever it is, and the guy comes up to him like, "Oh, you drove me and my brother," and he's like obviously alluding to a previous job. And you just get that fucking incredible moment where Gosling just spins around, and that's like evil Gosling just comes out.
How about you shut your mouth? I'll kick your teeth in and shut it for you. Yeah.
Literally, like, gave me chills when I saw that today. I was like, fuck, man, Gosling should have got awards for that.
Then also there's an element of that where, like, that happens directly after Standard's introduced into the movie. So he's kind of in this state of turmoil anyway. And it's one before we finish this, we've actually ended up talking more about character stuff than we did about the style, which is interesting with a Winding Refn movie. But just to quickly touch on that, it's a Winding Refn movie. It's stylish as fuck. High contrast lighting.
It's objectively gorgeous.
Yeah, I think it's one of the most aesthetically perfect movies I've ever seen, and I'll stand by that. One thing I will say about Winding Refn is he shares an affliction with me, which you may or may not know, actually, Mike, which is colour blindness for mid-range colours. So one of the reasons I'm always drawn towards his movies is they're incredibly high contrast and often use primary colours. So basically, I can see them better.
Well, that makes sense.
It's actually a surprisingly common trait among directors, actually, because Christopher Nolan's colourblind as well.
I mean, I'm always very much about. I mean, we've talked about this on the show before, but like, I love movies with very strong, vibrant color palettes. I think that's why there's a lot of movies from like the sort of turn of the century through to like 2010. Like, there's a lot of movies which had very blue color palettes, very desaturated color palettes, and I just really don't vibe with that. Give me vibrant colors.
I find that very hard to watch. The very like.
Yeah, I find it just not it's not visually arresting enough for me. Whereas Drive actually is like, a lot of people think of it and they always immediately go like the kind of neon aesthetic, but like there's a lot of different things going on in Drive. There's a lot of like sort of really warm color palettes, especially like when they go to the lake with Irene and Benicio, and then you've also got like when they're going to the pawn shop to do the heist. It's very kind of naturalistic in that moment. Then like the car chases and stuff, they sort of desaturate down a little bit for that, and then it gets vibrant again after that. And there's a lot going on in this movie.
It's always shot with
it's just bathed in neon.
Yeah, it's always shot with like the very high contrast style. Even the more naturalistic or warm colours, it's very like you know, you're getting very strong like oranges and yellows against blacks kind of thing. Like it's I mean that is Nick Winding Refn's style. I'm calling him Nick as friends.
And again, you know, like going back to what is my favourite Winding Refn movie. This is his best movie. I will say this is like, I think this is his best film. But my favourite, The Neon Demon, I love that because that is just an assault of colour. That movie's almost too much.
I mean, I love The Neon Demon. I think if I had to pick my favourite of his, Drive is my favourite and his best. People would make a case for Bronson, which I do like a lot. I wouldn't begrudge anyone saying that that's his best film. Personally, for me, Drive is like, it's the kind of perfect synthesis of everything that Nicholas Winding Refn does. Whereas like Bronson is just like an incredible 5-star movie and has his visual style, but also it must have been written by someone else, but it's very dialogue heavy, which is like not something I would necessarily. And that doesn't mean make it a lesser film; it just makes it a lesser Winding Refn film, in my opinion. Before we finish on this analysis of Drive, one thing that I wanted to talk about, which I haven't seen discussed too much, but I thought we could do a little bit of a Kino Inferno. What do you think of this? So, the iconic jacket that Ryan Gosling wears in this movie, this kind of white, I guess it's like a puffer jacket, right? And it's got a...
It's sort of, I thought it was leather, isn't it?
I'm not sure if it's leather, but regardless, the iconic jacket, if you don't know what we're talking about, Google Ryan Gosling Drive and you'll see it. But crucially with the gold scorpion on the back, which is a sick as hell look.
Absolutely.
But you now cannot wear it without looking like an absolute tool. And certainly
only Gosling can pull it off.
Certainly, so. I've only ever seen Gosling pull it off, and I've seen guys wearing that jacket. But the scorpion. I wanted to talk about this because this is an interesting piece of symbolism. It kind of ties into what we're saying about people in this movie just constantly making bad decisions. Because they allude on the phone to Albert Brooks at one point. The driver says, "Have you ever heard the tale of the scorpion and the frog?" I don't know if you're familiar with this. I think it's an Aesop fable. Basically, the long and short of it is, there's a frog and a scorpion. They both want to cross the river, and the scorpion says, "Oh, give me a lift on your back," to the frog, and the frog's like, "No, you'll sting me. I'm not doing that." And the scorpion's like, "Why would I sting you? I'll drown." And the frog's like, "Yeah, a good point." And the scorpion gets on the frog's back, and halfway across the river, the scorpion stings the frog. And as the frog's dying and they're both about to drown, he says, "Why did you do that?" And the scorpion says, "It's in my nature." Which I think is interesting when you consider that metaphor in this movie, because we have... Well, there's kind of two interpretations from my point of view that I wanted to get your thoughts on. Number one, either the driver is the frog, who's constantly being stung by the scorpions around him, because he carries them to and fro, and yet... on some level he knows it's in their nature to fuck him over. Or the driver is the scorpion, which I think is another interesting way to look at it, right? Where it's like, it's in his nature to... Or maybe it's both even, where it's like, it is kind of in his nature to be, this violent machine in some way. Like, I don't know, I just wanted to get your thoughts on that, because that's something that I've not really seen discussed, that I think is like a really... Like, it's an obviously placed symbol in the movie because you see that scorpion so many times, and then he has the line about, the story of the scorpion and the frog.
I think it's incredibly well implemented. I lean more on the side of him actually being the scorpion, because I do think it is in his nature. There's a lot of things that indicate towards him actually being like this, and like the side of him that you see when he's around Irene is like, I feel like that is still him as well, but that's just a side of him that he just never really gets to explore, and I think that might go some ways to explaining his awkwardness around her and stuff.
Yeah.
However, if you're going on on the nose symbolism way, he's the frog because he quite literally has the scorpion on his back. So I think you could definitely read it both ways. I'm more of the opinion that he's the Scorpion.
Yeah, I think that's kind of what I'd lean towards too, in the sense that pretty much everyone in this movie is the Scorpion, right? Where when you boil down everyone's actions in this film, it kind of boils down to it's just what's in their nature to do.
Yeah, I mean, you could say that Irene is more like, if you're applying this to all of the characters across the movie, Irene definitely seems more like the Frog, because she's, she's not exactly had the best of lives.
Also, I think it's in her nature. You could read it like her kind of negative flaw. What's in her nature, I suppose, is to latch herself onto these men who are initially very charming, but obviously have their gaping and very obvious flaws to anyone else. I mean, you look at Standard and the Driver, and neither of them are ideal to raise a child, let's say.
No. And then you've also got Nino, who, all of his life has just been, put upon by others and has, been subject to a lot of, anti-Semitism, particularly amongst, the sort of crime family that he's, isn't he saying he's a part of, or,
Yeah, he's saying he affiliates with them,
Yeah, and so he in that sense is very much the Frog in that scenario.
Yeah.
I think that you could apply that to all of these characters and it would fit in some way, but I think they all definitely fit one role more than the other.
Yeah.
I'm kind of glad you brought that up, actually.
Yeah, this was interesting because the movie so clearly flags that up, but I've not really seen that discussed as part of the symbolism of the film before, or not to any great extent anyway. Because I think this movie ultimately is about that thing of people having this kind of tragic flaw, or this kind of thing that they can't get past that ultimately brings them down, and in the Driver's case, it's this thing of this double life that he lives, where on some level he can't leave behind this. You see his apartment, he doesn't have a life. His whole thing is just he fixes cars and he does crimes, which even though
there are worse lives, I guess.
Even though he clearly has contempt for the criminal element, right? Whenever he interacts with Albert Brooks, he clearly doesn't want anything to do with them. But when he kind of sees Standard for what he really is, he's contemptuous of him in more ways than one. When he's dealing with fucking Christina Hendricks later on, he fucking slaps her across the mouth, and he's like, "I'll fucking hurt you."
Yeah, he fucking that again. I've forgotten about that as well. I remember her getting her head blown off.
Yeah.
I remember that quite vividly. But when he pushes her down on the bed and basically says if you don't start telling the truth, I'm going to hurt you. And again, this is why I'm Team Scorpion in this. I'm he's hurt a woman before.
I think he's hurt a lot of people before. Yeah.
And it's. Yeah, there's a real cruelty to the way that he attacks people as well. He goes for the pain, and
he wants them to suffer. And it's kind of interesting that scene as well, because he says to her "Oh, you just got a little boy's father killed." And it's okay, mate. But, I mean, she did. Fair enough. You're right to be angry with her, but also a bit weird for you to be Team Standard, because at the end of the day.
Yeah, the pot is calling the kettle a cold-blooded murderer.
And it's interesting because he almost has that, when he's dealing with the criminals, he has that thing of, I wait around for 5 minutes, and if you're not out in 5 minutes, I fuck off. He has this contempt for them that I think is kind of interesting, because it's but it's almost he can't not do it. It's that.
Yeah, and again, that plays into the sort of the noir elements of it, because that is a lot of protagonists in a lot of the sort of traditional film noir stories do have those sort of character flaws, and they do have these things that are so inherent to their nature that do eventually bring about their downfall, be it they're so easily led by a pretty face, or they have a substance abuse problem that ultimately leads them down a path where they end up involved with the wrong people, or they have violent tendencies that tend to get them into the wrong the wrong company and stuff like that. This, and a lot of the characters in this movie are sort of archetypes from noir movies as well, but they're explored in slightly more detail, and
Blanche is kind of it's kind of a weird take on the femme fatale, right? Where
she's kind of like the gangster's mole more than anything, isn't she?
She has that element of she is duplicitous, but she's also kind of shit at it, which I think is interesting.
It honestly, I feel Blanche as a character is completely personified by the way that Christina Hendricks walks.
Yeah.
There's this kind of like schlubbiness.
It's like tottering around on her high heels. Yeah. You know, Christina Hendricks is an elegant, full-figured woman, but in this movie they do.
She's one of the most beautiful creatures on this planet, and in this movie, it's like she's what's the woman from Married with Children? It's kind of that level.
I love as well the scene where he's interacting with her boyfriend Cook, where he basically says to Standard, like, go and get a fucking ice cream with Blanche or whatever he says. I just treats them like kids.
I mean, we could probably keep talking about this movie, but like, I think we've sung its praises enough. I mean, Aiden, is Drive Kino?
Yeah, I mean, obviously it's Kino. Like, what are we talking about?
Obviously it is. Obviously.
You know, it's like I've said, it's one of my favourite movies. I'll watch it time and time again because it is with credits. It's 100 minutes. I think I checked when I paused the movie after it finished. It's like 93 minutes of actual movie, which, considering how long we've been talking about it, they pack a lot into those tight 93 minutes. You know.
It's incredibly well paced as well, because I remember pausing it at one point to go get a drink and thinking, because I paused it, I was like 50 minutes in, and I was just like, it doesn't feel like 5 minutes since I've like put this on.
Yeah,
like, it just flies.
It goes by real quick, goes down real smooth. What more can be said?
Unlike Mickey Ducks.
Unlike Mickey Ducks, it goes down rough as arseholes. No, but yeah, to sum up on this movie,
dies for his art.
I think if you only get it, if we only preserve one Ryan Gosling movie in the future Holocaust of movies, this would be it. I think, kind of as well if you only preserved one Winding Refn movie in the future burning of all films. I think this would be it as well.
Yeah, as much as I love the trash-tastic Neon Demon, Drive is the one that I'd want to preserve.
Yeah, he's done many interesting films, but I think this is the one that every time I watch it, I think this just is a modern classic. Like it's great.
Yeah, I mean, considering I hadn't seen it in the longest time before watching it, and I finished watching it half an hour before we started recording, so it's very, very fresh in my brain.
Classic.
It was amazing seeing it again, because I do recall the first time I saw it being really quite blown away by how good it was, but because it's been so long, I didn't remember a lot of it. I remembered the feeling I got after I first saw it, and I felt exactly the same after watching it this time. I think it's just such a good film, and some people might be put off by all the film bros that really kind of latched onto it, but it's worthy of that. It's worthy of this huge cult following that it's got, because it is such a good film.
Yeah,
I think maybe the marketing did mislead a lot of people. I think a lot of people get the wrong impression.
Yeah, they think it's going to be an action movie. Yeah.
Like Fast and Furious is obviously what a lot of people assume when they. And I think the trailers. I mean, I do recall seeing a trailer for this movie.
If I may, I think people were expecting moving more along the lines of like Baby Driver, like it's a chase movie.
Yeah.
Obviously, that's more cartoony, but that kind of thing where it's like it's about the car chases.
Yeah, and I think that if I do remember correctly, I didn't go back and watch any of the trailers for this show, but I think I do remember the trailers focusing more on the driving aspect.
Yeah.
And playing that up a lot more. So I guess I feel I can sort of understand why.
That's why I didn't see it in the cinema. Like, I saw a trailer for it. I was just like, it looks okay. I'd somehow missed that it was a Winding Refn movie and great. But then by the time the kind of, like I said, by the time the buzz was at its height, the movie was out of theatres here in the UK. So,
because before we go, the one thing that I do want to quickly just mention, because obviously, yes, it's a Kino from me. It's a definite Kino from me. I actually might watch this film again relatively soon, because it was far too long since I last saw it, and I thought it was, if anything, I think I enjoyed it more this second time.
I was just thinking that next time I'm at a friend's and they're like, what movie should we put on? I actually might put on Drive, even if it's relatively soon.
Yeah. But mentioning how like some people may have been misled into thinking this was more of a car chase movie, the opening scene where you see him picking up the criminals and doing the job, that is one of the most tense car chase segments in any movie ever, and it's not your typical car chase. If anything, it's a really quite slow and methodical take on the car chase.
Like, how is he going to get out of the line of sight of the cops? And
there's a lot of him stopping and waiting, and it really builds suspense. And I was watching it thinking, what car chase movies don't do this?
bathed in his shadow as well, because most of it's inside the car, right? That's kind of what makes it interesting. And you're seeing the faces of the guys in the back seat, and you're seeing him just like focused, and like you get so many shots of like the rear view mirror where it's just his eyes. It's almost like a Sergio Leone shot, but it's also taking in the entire front of the car, right? Because you're seeing it.
It's just fantastic, absolutely fantastic. Like I can't even think of like really a criticism of this movie, because I know, I talked about the violence and thinking it feels a little bit at odds, but it's still part of the overall film, and it still has its place in the movie, and I can't really criticize its inclusion when I completely understand the intention of why it's there.
Movie rules.
Kino, massive Kino, huge Kino.
One thing I will say before we wrap this episode up, if you have seen this movie, Drive, and you're a little film bro, and you want to expand your repertoire, I would suggest obviously Baby Driver I would suggest, although with Kevin Spacey in it, it's a tough watch these days. Obviously, I think Baby Driver actually takes influence from this, as well as the two films I'm about to mention. Well, the first film I would recommend if you're into this movie, which is definitely an influence on this, is The Driver. It's a Walter Hill film from the late 70s.
Yep.
Awesome movie. Similar tonally and obviously similar thematically. I think Driver's a better film, but The Driver is it's worth watching. That's kind of a neo-noir as well. It's kind of it's a cool movie. I would also recommend Jean-Pierre Melville's Le Samouraï, which tonally is very influential on this film. I would also recommend Melville in general. I would suspect, without looking into it, probably an influence on Winding Refn. His films are famous for having long stretches without dialogue. You're just watching characters do shit. Le Samouraï is no different. He also made a movie, The Red Circle, Le Cercle Rouge, which is a heist movie, and it kind of builds up to like a 40-minute heist scene where there's just no dialogue. You're just watching the characters fucking do shit. You know me, Mark, and you know that is entirely to my tastes.
100%.
I would also Michael Mann's Heat. Not Heat. Everyone's seen Heat. Michael Mann's Thief. Although I'd recommend Heat as well, but not so much in relation to this movie. I'd recommend Thief though. Yeah. That's a new feature I'm starting, Mark. It's called Aidan Bollocks On About Films That No One Cares About at the end of every episode.
Do you know what? I care. So it's not nobody cares.
I mean, I'll probably make you watch all of the films I've just referenced over the course of this podcast.
Please do. I'm always looking for new movies to watch, or new movies to add to my actual watch pile and never actually touch it.
Yeah, new movies like Jean-Pierre Melville's movie from 1967.
Hey, that's what I classify as new movies. Like, I've actually had friends say that to me before. I go, I watched this movie recently. And I always say, to me, if it's a film that's new to me, I say it's a new movie. Yeah. I'll be like, I discovered this new slasher movie. And people will be like, when did it come out? I'm like, it came out like 1982. But it's new to me. But no, I'm always looking for stuff like that to watch. I mean, I've got so many things to watch anyway. But yeah, anything you chuck my way that might be like this, by all means, we're
definitely going to do Thief at some point, if only because James Caan died recently. And it's, in my opinion, it's the James Caan movie. I know that people will probably remember him more from like The Godfather and stuff like that, but I like him in Thief. I mean, I like Michael Mann in general. Anyway, we are just having a conversation now, so maybe we should wrap this episode up.
We should wrap it up. So you know where to find us on social media, guys. Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, YouTube, Stitcher, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Kino Inferno or Kino_Inferno, depending on if some fucking bastard took our username. If you're out there, we'll find you.
We will find you.
Yeah.
We'll stomp your head.
We will find you. We're going to send the Roo after you.
The Roo will stomp your head.
You'll just be there in your cozy little bed at night, just thinking everything's all right with the world. Just had a little cup of herbal tea, nice and relaxed, and all you're going to hear is boing, boing, boing.
All right, mate. You've been taking our domain names, have you? In the movie of this podcast, the Roo is going to be played by Ben Mendelsohn.
Kino Inferno, the movie, coming 2025.
Starring me, Mendo. That's Ben Mendelsohn, he just popped through and laughed. Anyway, let's...
Friend of the pod, Ben Mendelsohn.
You know what? Ben Mendelsohn, if you're listening to this and you want to be on the pod with your sinister, slightly lispy Australian voice, by all means, please.
Get in touch, mate.
Please.
The rule sort it out for
If
us.
anyone knows but Mendo, get him on.
Ben Mendolorian.
Alright, come on. Let's end this podcast. I've been Aidan.
I've been Mark.
I've been Ryan Gosling.
Would you kindly tell us if you had a relationship with Mr. Buzz?
Oh, I don't know, you know. Don't you know? I had rumpy-pumpy with him for a year and a half. I did so enjoy my rumpy-pumpy with Mr. Buzz. It gave me such pleasure.
This is a no-smoking room, Miss Tremel.
Miss Tremel, have you ever taken drugs?
Occasionally.
Have you ever taken drugs with Mr. Buzz?
Certainly.
What kind of drugs?
Pepto-Bismol for the dicky tummy. Have you ever tried post-dicky tummy rumpy-pumpy on Pepto-Bismol? It really is